Orlando by Virginia Woolf, read by Tilda Swinton. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at the head of a moor which swung from the rafters. Orlando's father, or perhaps his grandfather, had struck it from the shoulders of a vast pagan in the barbarian fields of Africa, and now it swung, gently, perpetually, in the breeze which never ceased blowing through the attic rooms of the gigantic house of the lord who had slain him. Orlando's fathers had ridden in fields of asphodel, and stony fields, and fields watered by strange rivers, and they had struck many heads off many shoulders, and brought them back to hang from the rafters. So too would Orlando, he vowed. But since he was 16 only, and too young to ride with them in Africa or France, he would steal away and go to his attic room, and there lunge and plunge and slice the air with his blade. Orlando threw the window open, sat down at the table, took out a writing book labelled Ethelbert, a Tragedy in 5 Acts, and dipped an old stained goosequill in the ink. Soon he had covered 10 pages and more with poetry. He was fluent, evidently, but he was abstract. Vice, crime, misery were the personages of his drama. There was never a word said as he himself would have said it, but all was turned with a fluency and sweetness which, considering his age, and that the 16th century had still some years of its course to run, were remarkable enough. At last, however, he came to a halt. Once look out of a window at the sun setting, and one drops the pen, takes one's cloak, and strides out of the room. Orlando was careful to avoid meeting anyone. There was Stubbs, the gardener, coming along the path. He hid behind a tree till he had passed. He let himself out at a little gate in the garden wall, and gained the ferny path leading uphill through the park unseen. Orlando naturally loved solitary places, vast views, and to feel himself for ever and ever and ever alone. "I am alone," he breathed at last. He had walked very quickly uphill to a place crowned by a single oak tree. It was very high, so high indeed that 19 English counties could be seen beneath, and on clear days 30 or perhaps 40. Sometimes one could see the English Channel. Rivers could be seen, and pleasure boats gliding on them, and galleons setting out to sea, and armadas with puffs of smoke from which came the dull thud of cannon firing. To the east there were the spires of London and the smoke of the city. And perhaps on the very skyline, when the wind was in the right quarter, the craggy top and serrated edges of Snowdon herself showed mountainous among the clouds. For a moment Orlando stood counting, gazing, recognizing. That was his father's house, that his uncle's. His aunt owned those 3 great turrets among the trees there. The heath was theirs, and the forest, the pheasant and the deer, the fox, the badger, and the butterfly. He sighed profoundly and flung himself on the earth at the foot of the oak tree. He loved to feel the earth's spine beneath him, for such he took the hard root of the oak tree to be. His limbs grew heavy on the ground. After an hour or so, a trumpet sounded. Orlando leapt to his feet. The shrill sound came from the valley. It came from the heart of his own great house. The Queen had come. Orlando dashed downhill. He let himself in at a wicket gate. He tore up the winding staircase. He reached his room. He tossed his stockings to one side of the room, his jerkin to the other. He dipped his head. He scoured his hands. He pared his fingernails. With no more than 6 inches of looking-glass and a pair of old candles to help him, he had thrust on crimson breeches, lace collar, waistcoat of taffeta, and shoes with rosettes on them in less than 10 minutes. He was ready. But he was terribly late. By shortcuts known to him, he made his way now to the banqueting hall, 5 acres distant on the other side of the house. But halfway there, in the back quarters where the servants lived, he stopped. There, sitting at the servants' dinner table, with a tankard beside him and a paper in front of him, sat a rather fat, shabby man, whose ruff was a thought dirty and whose clothes were of hodden brown. He held a pen in his hand, but he was not writing. He seemed in the act of rolling some thought up and down, to and fro in his mind. His eyes were fixed. He did not see Orlando. For all his hurry, Orlando stopped dead. Was this a poet? Was he writing poetry? Orlando wanted to say, "Tell me everything in the whole world," for he had the wildest, most absurd ideas about poets and poetry. But how to speak to a man who does not see you? So Orlando stood gazing while the man mused, and then very quickly wrote 6 lines and looked up. Whereupon Orlando darted off, and reached the banqueting hall only just in time to sink upon his knees and offer a bowl of rose-water to the great Queen herself. Such was Orlando's shyness, that he saw no more of her than her ringed hands in water. But it was enough. It was a memorable hand, a thin hand with long fingers, always curling. A commanding hand, too. By the same showing, the Queen herself can have seen only a head. But the long curled hair, the dark head bent so reverently, so innocently before her, implied a heart of gold, and loyalty, and manly charm, qualities which the old woman loved the more they failed her. Innocence, simplicity, were all the more dear to her for the dark background she set them against. And it was that same night, so tradition has it, when Orlando was sound asleep, that she made over formally the gift of the great monastic house that had been the king's to Orlando's father. 2 years of Orlando's quiet country life had not passed, when a message came that he was to attend the Queen at Whitehall. "Here comes my innocent," she said, watching him advance down the long gallery towards her. He was the very image of a noble gentleman. Strength, grace, romance, folly, poetry, youth. She read him like a page. Instantly she plucked a ring from her finger, and as she fitted it to his, named him her treasurer and steward. Next hung about him chains of office, and bidding him bend his knee, tied round it at the slenderest part the jewelled order of the Garter. Nothing after that was denied him, for the old woman loved him, and she plotted for him a splendid, ambitious career. Lands were given him, houses assigned him. He was to be the son of her old age. Meanwhile, the long winter months drew on. One day, when the snow was on the ground and the dark panelled rooms were full of shadows, she saw through the door a boy. Could it be Orlando? Kissing a girl. Who in the devil's name was the brazen hussy? She was stricken after that, and groaned much of man's treachery. It was Orlando's fault, perhaps. Yet, after all, are we to blame Orlando? The age was the Elizabethan. Their morals were not ours. Girls were roses, and their seasons were short as the flowers. Plucked they must be before nightfall, for the day was brief. Orlando's taste was broad. He was no lover of garden flowers only. The weeds even had always a fascination for him. At this season of his life, the cheek of an innkeeper's daughter seemed fresher, and the wit of a gamekeeper's niece seemed quicker than those of the ladies at court. Hence he began going frequently to Wapping Old Stairs and the beer gardens at night, wrapped in a grey cloak to hide the star at his neck and the garter at his knee. There, with a mug before him, he listened to sailors' stories of hardship and horror and cruelty on the Spanish Main, how some had lost their toes, others their noses. The women perched on his knee, flung their arms round his neck, and guessing that something out of the common lay hid beneath his duffel cloak, were quite as eager to come at the truth of the matter as Orlando himself. Soon, however, Orlando grew tired, not only of the crabbed streets, but of the primitive manner of the people. So, always keeping them in happy memory, he left off frequenting the beer gardens and the skittle alleys, hung his grey cloak in his wardrobe, let his star shine at his neck and his garter twinkle at his knee, and appeared once more at the court of King James. He was young, he was rich, he was handsome. No one could have been received with greater acclamation than he was. It is certain indeed that many ladies were ready to show him their favours, but Euphrosyne, so he called her in his sonnets, was by far the most serious of his flames. She was by birth one of the Irish Desmonds, and had therefore a family tree of her own as old and deeply rooted as Orlando's itself. She was fair, spoke Italian well, and had a perfect set of teeth. She would have made a perfect wife for such a nobleman as Orlando, and matters had gone so far that the lawyers on both sides were busy with covenants, jointures, and settlements, when, with the suddenness and severity that then marked the English climate, came the Great Frost. The Great Frost was, historians tell us, the most severe that has ever visited these islands. Birds froze in mid-air and fell like stones to the ground. At Norwich, a young countrywoman started to cross the road in her usual robust health, and was seen by the onlookers to turn visibly to powder and be blown in a puff of dust over the roofs as the icy blast struck her. Corpses froze and could not be drawn from the sheets. It was no uncommon sight to come upon a whole herd of swine frozen immovable upon the road. It was commonly supposed that the great increase of rocks in some parts of Derbyshire was due to the solidification of unfortunate wayfarers who had been turned literally to stone where they stood. But while the country people suffered the extremity of want, and the trade of the country was at a standstill, London enjoyed a carnival of the utmost brilliancy. The court was at Greenwich, and the new king seized the opportunity that his coronation gave him to curry favour with the citizens. He directed that the river, which was frozen to a depth of 20 feet and more for 6 or 7 miles on either side, should be swept, decorated, and given all the semblance of a park or pleasure ground, with arbours, mazes, alleys, drinking booths, etc., at his expense. For himself and the courtiers he reserved a certain space immediately opposite the palace gates, which, railed off from the public only by a silken rope, became at once the centre of the most brilliant society in England. Great statesmen dispatched affairs of state under the crimson awning of the royal pagoda. Soldiers planned the downfall of the Turk in striped arbours. Lovers dallied upon divans spread with sables. Here and there burnt vast bonfires of cedar and oak wood, lavishly salted, so that the flames were of green, orange, and purple fire. But however fiercely they burnt, the heat was not enough to melt the ice. It was at night that the carnival was at its merriest. The moon and stars blazed with the hard fixity of diamonds, and to the fine music of flute and trumpet, the courtiers danced. Orlando had indeed just brought his feet together about 6 in the evening of the 7th of January at the finish of some quadrille or minuet, when he beheld, coming from the pavilion of the Muscovite embassy, a figure. Whether boy's or woman's, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex, it filled him with the highest curiosity. Extraordinary seductiveness issued from the whole person, whatever the name or sex. Images, metaphors twined and twisted in his mind. He called her a melon, a pineapple, an olive tree, an emerald, and a fox in the snow, all in the space of 3 seconds. He did not know whether he had heard her, tasted her, seen her, or all 3 together. So he raved, so he stared. When the boy, for alas, a boy it must be, no woman could skate with such speed and vigour, swept past him, Orlando was ready to tear his hair with vexation that the person was of his own sex, and thus all embraces were out of the question. But the skater came closer. No boy ever had a mouth like that. No boy had those breasts. No boy had eyes which looked as if they had been fished from the bottom of the sea. Finally, the unknown skater came to a standstill. She was not a hand's breadth off. She was a woman. Orlando stared, trembled, turned hot, turned cold. The Lady Euphrosyne hung upon his arm. The stranger's name, he found, was the Princess Marusha Stanilovska Dagmar Natasha Ilyana Romanovich, and she had come in the train of the Muscovite ambassador, who was her uncle, perhaps, or perhaps her father, to attend the coronation. Very little was known of the Muscovites. In their great beards and furred hats they sat almost silent. None spoke English, and French, with which some at least were familiar, was then little spoken at the English court. It was through this accident that Orlando and the princess became acquainted. They were seated opposite each other at the great table spread under a huge awning for the entertainment of the notables. As Orlando looked at her, the thickness of his blood melted. The ice turned to wine in his veins. He heard the waters flowing and the birds singing. His manhood woke. In fact, he was rattling off one of his most impassioned sonnets when the princess addressed him. "Would you have the goodness to pass the salt?" He blushed deeply. "With all the pleasure in the world, madame," he replied, speaking French with a perfect accent. For he spoke the tongue as his own, his mother's maid, had taught him. The princess continued. Who were those bumpkins, she asked him, who sat beside her with the manners of stablemen? What was this nauseating mixture they had poured on her plate? Did the dogs eat at the same table with the men in England? Was that figure of fun at the end of the table really the Queen? And did the King always slobber like that? Orlando saw from the blank faces of the company that nobody understood a word, so he answered her as freely as she asked him, speaking, as she did, in perfect French. Thus began an intimacy between the two which soon became the scandal of the court. Soon it was observed that Orlando paid the Muscovite far more attention than mere civility demanded. He was seldom far from her side, and their conversation, though unintelligible to the rest, was carried on with such animation that the dullest could guess the subject. The old men shrugged their shoulders. The young tittered between their fingers. All knew that Orlando was betrothed to another. The Lady Margaret O'Brien O'Dare O'Reilly Tyrconnell, for that was the proper name of Euphrosyne of the sonnets, wore Orlando's splendid sapphire on the second finger of her left hand. It was she who had the supreme right to his attentions. Yet she might drop all the handkerchiefs in her wardrobe, and Orlando never stooped to pick them up. She might wait 20 minutes for him to hand her to her sledge, and in the end have to be content with the services of her blackamoor. But what most outraged the court was that Orlando and the Muscovite were often seen to slip under the silken rope which railed off the royal enclosure from the public part of the river, and to disappear among the crowd of common people. Orlando took her into the city, showed her the beef-eaters, and bought her whatever took her fancy in the Royal Exchange. But this was not enough. Each increasingly desired the other's company in privacy all day long. Instead of taking the road to London, therefore, they turned the other way about, and were soon beyond the crowd among the frozen reaches of the Thames, where not a living soul ever came their way. Hence Orlando and Sasha, as he called her for short, had the river to themselves. Hot with skating and with love, they would throw themselves down in some solitary reach, and Orlando would take her in his arms and know, for the first time, the delights of love. Skating farther than their wont one day, they reached that part of the river where the ships had anchored and been frozen in midstream. Among them was the ship of the Muscovite embassy, flying its double-headed black eagle from the main mast. Sasha had left some of her clothing on board, and supposing the ship to be empty, they climbed on deck and went in search of it. They had not ventured far when a fine young man started up from some business of his own behind a coil of rope, and saying apparently, for he spoke Russian, that he was one of the crew and would help the princess to find what she wanted, lit a lump of candle and disappeared with her into the lower parts of the ship. Time went by, and Orlando, wrapped in his own dreams, thought only of the pleasures of life, of his jewel, of her rarity, of means for making her irrevocably and indissolubly his own. Obstacles there were, and hardships to overcome. She was determined to live in Russia. But he was not anxious to cease his pleasant country ways of sport, relinquish his office, ruin his career, drink vodka instead of canary. Still, all this and more than all this he would do for her sake. As for his marriage to the Lady Margaret, fixed though it was for this day se'nnight, the thing was so palpably absurd that he scarcely gave it a thought. His friends would deride him for ruining the finest career in the world for a Cossack woman and a waste of snow. It weighed not a straw in the balance compared with Sasha herself. On the first dark night they would fly. They would take ship to Russia. So he pondered. So he plotted as he walked up and down the deck. He was recalled, turning westward, by the sight of the sun, slung like an orange on the cross of St. Paul's. It must be almost evening. Sasha had been gone this hour and more. Seized instantly with those dark forebodings which shadowed even his most confident thoughts of her, he plunged into the hold of the ship, and after stumbling among chests and barrels in the darkness, was made aware by a faint glimmer in the corner that they were seated there. For 1 second he had a vision of them, saw Sasha seated on the sailor's knee, saw her bend towards him, saw them embrace before the light was blotted out in a red cloud by his rage. He blazed into such a howl of anguish that the whole ship echoed. Then a deadly sickness came over Orlando, and they had to give him brandy before he revived. And then, when he had recovered, Sasha hung over him. Had not the candle guttered? Had not the shadows moved? Orlando believed her one moment. The next was the more violent with anger at her deceit. Then Sasha herself stamped her foot on deck, called upon her gods to destroy her if she, a Romanovich, had lain in the arms of a common seaman. So Orlando yielded, believed her, and asked her pardon. Skating back, Sasha, as if to reassure him, was tenderer than usual and even more delightful. As they approached the carnival, they heard a deep note like that struck on a tuning fork, which boomed louder and louder until it became an uproar. Every now and then a great shout followed a rocket into the air. At one moment the woods and distant hills showed green as on a summer's day. The next all was winter and blackness again. By this time Orlando and the princess were close to the royal enclosure, and found their way barred by a great crowd of the common people, who were pressing as near to the silken rope as they dared. The couple lingered there. The night was dark. It was pitch dark. It was on such a night as this that they had planned to fly. The time had come. With a burst of passion, Orlando hissed in Sasha's ear, "Jour de ma vie," It was their signal. At midnight they would meet at an inn near Blackfriars. Horses waited there. Everything was in readiness for their flight. So they parted, she to her tent, he to his. Long before midnight, Orlando was in waiting. The night was of so inky a blackness that a man was on you before he could be seen, which was all to the good, but it was also of the most solemn stillness, so that a horse's hoof could be heard at a distance of 1/2 mile. Orlando listened to every footfall, speculated on every sound. Each drunken shout cut his heart to the quick, as if it boded ill omen to his venture. Yet he had no fear for Sasha. Her courage made nothing of the adventure. She would come alone, in her cloak and trousers, booted like a man. So he waited in the darkness. Suddenly he was struck in the face by a blow, soft yet heavy on the side of his cheek. The blow was repeated 12 times on forehead and cheek. It took him a minute to realize that these were raindrops falling. In the space of 5 minutes, Orlando was soaked to the skin. Hastily putting the horses under cover, he sought shelter beneath the lintel of the door whence he could still observe the courtyard. The roads would be under water and perhaps impassable. But all his senses were bent upon gazing along the cobbled pathway for Sasha's coming. Suddenly, with an awful and ominous voice, St. Paul struck the first stroke of midnight. 4 times more it struck remorselessly. To Orlando's apprehensive mind, they seemed notes proclaiming death and disaster. When the 12th struck, he knew that his doom was sealed. It was useless for the rational part of him to reason. She might be late, she might have missed her way. The passionate and feeling heart of Orlando knew the truth. He stood in the doorway in the tremendous rain without moving. In the thick of it, great guns seemed to boom. There were also terrible inhuman groanings. But Orlando stood there immovable till Paul's clock struck 2, and then, crying aloud, he dashed the lantern to the ground, mounted his horse, and galloped he knew not where. Some blind instinct must have driven him to take the riverbank in the direction of the sea. For when the dawn broke, he found himself on the banks of the Thames off Wapping. Now a sight of the most extraordinary nature met his eyes. Where, for 3 months and more, there had been solid ice of such thickness that it seemed permanent as stone, was now a race of turbulent yellow waters. The river had gained its freedom in the night. All was riot and confusion. The river was strewn with icebergs. Some of these were as high as a house, others no bigger than a man's hat. But what was the most awful was the sight of the human creatures who had been trapped in the night and now paced their islands in the utmost agony of spirit. Whether they jumped into the flood or stayed on the ice, their doom was certain. Sometimes quite a cluster of these poor creatures would come down together. At other times, a solitary wretch would stride his narrow tenement alone. As they swept out to sea, some could be heard crying vainly for help, making wild promises to amend their ways, confessing their sins and vowing altars and wealth if God would hear their prayers. Others were so dazed with terror that they sat immovable and silent. Astounded, Orlando could do nothing for some time but watch the appalling race of waters as it hurled itself past him. At last he clapped spurs to his horse. Rounding a bend of the river, he came opposite that reach where, not 2 days ago, the ships of the ambassadors had seemed immovably frozen. Hastily he made count of them all: the French, the Spanish, the Austrian, the Turk. All still floated. But the Russian ship was nowhere to be seen. For one moment Orlando thought it must have foundered. but raising himself in his stirrups and shading his eyes, he could just make out the shape of a ship on the horizon. The black eagles were flying from the masthead. The ship of the Muscovite embassy was standing out to sea. Flinging himself from his horse, he made in his rage as if he would breast the flood. Standing knee-deep in water, he hurled at the faithless woman all the insults that have ever been the lot of her sex. Faithless, mutable, fickle, he called her. Devil, adulteress, deceiver. And the swirling waters took his words and tossed at his feet a broken pot and a little straw. In the summer of that disastrous winter, which saw the frost, the flood, the deaths of many thousands, and the complete downfall of Orlando's hopes, for he was exiled from court in deep disgrace, Orlando retired to his great house in the country, and there lived in complete solitude. One June morning, it was Saturday the 18th, he failed to rise at his usual hour, and when his groom went to call him, he was found fast asleep. Nor could he be awakened. He lay as if in a trance, without perceptible breathing, and though dogs were set to bark under his window, cymbals beaten perpetually in his room, and mustard plasters applied to his feet, still he did not wake, take food, or show any sign of life, for 7 whole days. On the 7th day, he woke at his usual time, 8:15 precisely, and turned the whole posse of caterwauling wives and village soothsayers out of his room, which was natural enough. But what was strange was that he showed no consciousness of any such trance, but dressed himself and sent for his horse, as if he had woken from a single night's slumber. Had Orlando, worn out by the extremity of his suffering, died for a week and then come to life again? And if so, of what nature is death, and what nature life? Having waited for an answer to these questions and none coming, let us get on with the story. Now Orlando gave himself up to a life of extreme solitude. His disgrace at court and the violence of his grief were partly the reason of it, but as he made no effort to defend himself and seldom invited anyone to visit him, it appeared as if to be alone in the great house of his fathers suited his temper. Solitude was his choice. How he spent his time nobody quite knew. The servants watched, in the dark of the evening, a light passing along the galleries, through the banqueting halls, up the staircase, into the bedrooms, and knew that their master was perambulating the house alone. None dared follow him, but they all held him in high respect, and cursed the foreign princess who had brought him to this pass. Orlando took a strange delight in thoughts of death and decay, and, after pacing the long galleries and ballrooms, would mount into the family pew and sit for hours watching the moonlight waver. Even this was not enough for him, but he must descend into the crypt where his ancestors lay, coffin piled upon coffin, for 10 generations together. Then it seemed to him that life was not worth living any more. Forgetting the bones of his ancestors and how life is founded on a grave, he stood there, shaken with sobs, all for the desire of a woman in Russian trousers, with slanting eyes, a pouting mouth, and pearls about her neck. She had gone. She had left him. He was never to see her again. And so he sobbed. And so he found his way back to his own rooms. Orlando now drew his chair up to the table, opened the work of Sir Thomas Browne, and proceeded to investigate the delicate articulation of one of the doctor's longest and most marvellously contorted cogitations. Orlando's taste for books was an early one. He was a nobleman afflicted with a love of literature. It was the fatal nature of this disease to substitute a phantom for reality, so that Orlando, to whom fortune had given every gift, plate, linen, houses, men-servants, carpets, beds in profusion, had only to open a book for the whole vast accumulation to turn to mist. The 9 acres of stone which were his house vanished. 150 indoor servants disappeared. His 80 riding horses became invisible. Orlando would sit by himself, reading, a naked man. The disease gained rapidly upon him now in his solitude. He would read often 6 hours into the night. And once the disease of reading has laid upon the system, it weakens it, so that it falls easy prey to that other scourge which dwells in the inkpot and festers in the quill. The wretch takes to writing. When he had read for an hour or so in Sir Thomas Browne, and the bark of the stag showed that it was the dead of night, he took a silver key from his pocket and unlocked the doors of a great inlaid cabinet which stood in the corner. Within were some 50 drawers of cedar wood, and upon each was a paper neatly written in Orlando's hand. One was inscribed, "The Death of Ajax," another, "The Birth of Pyramus," another, "Iphigenia in Aulis." The truth was that Orlando had been afflicted thus for many years. Before he was turned 25, some 47 plays had been written, histories, romances, poems, some in prose, some in verse, some in French, some in Italian, all romantic and all long. Now, however, that it was the dead of night and he was alone, he chose from this repository one thick document called Xenophila, a Tragedy, or some such title, and one thin one called simply The Oak Tree, and then he approached the inkhorn and fingered the quill. But he paused. Orlando, dipping his pen in the ink, saw the mocking face of the lost princess, and asked himself a million questions instantly. Where was she, and why had she left him? Was the ambassador her uncle or her lover? Had they plotted? Was she forced? Was she married? Was she dead? All of which so drove their venom into him that the ink spurted over the table, which act at once substituted for the face of the princess a face of a very different sort. "This," said Orlando, "is the face of that rather fat, shabby man who sat in that room ever so many years ago when old Queen Bess came here to dine, and I saw him sitting at the table as I peeped in on my way downstairs, and he had the most amazing eyes that ever were. But who the devil was he? A poet, I dare say." Ambition, poetry, and a desire of fame all joined hands and made of his heart their dancing ground. Standing upright in the solitude of his room, Orlando vowed that he would be the first poet of his race and bring immortal lustre upon his name. It was to settle the question of whether he was the divinest genius or the greatest fool in the world that he decided, after many months of feverish labour, to break the solitude of years and communicate with the outer world. He had a friend in London, one Giles Isham of Norfolk, who was acquainted with writers, and could doubtless put him in touch with some member of that blessed fraternity. For, to Orlando in the state he was now in, there was a glory about a man who had written a book and had it printed, which outshone all the glories of blood and state. He now commissioned Mr. Isham of Norfolk to deliver to Mr. Nicholas Green of Clifford's Inn a document which set forth Orlando's admiration for his works, for Nick Green was a very famous writer at that time, and his desire to make his acquaintance, which he scarcely dared ask, for he had nothing to offer in return. But if Mr. Nicholas Green would condescend to visit him, a coach and 4 would be at the corner of Fetter Lane at whatever hour Mr. Green chose to appoint, and bring him safely to Orlando's house. One may figure Orlando's delight when, in no long time, Mr. Green signified his acceptance of the noble lord's invitation, took his place in the coach, and was set down in the hall to the south of the main building punctually at 7 o'clock on Monday, April the 21st, plainly dressed in his slouched hat and black doublet, carrying in one hand a small bag. Orlando was somewhat taken aback by his appearance, but they went to dinner. It was not until the Malmsey was passing freely that Orlando dared mention the sacred subject of poetry. At the first mention of the word, the poet's eyes flashed fire. he launched into one of the longest, most intricate and bitterest stories that Orlando had ever heard about a play of his, another poet and a critic. Of the nature of poetry itself, Orlando only gathered that it was harder to sell than prose, and though the lines were shorter, took longer in the writing. All that could be said, concluded Green, was that the art of poetry was dead in England. How that could be, with Shakespeare, Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Browne, Donne, all now writing or just having written, Orlando could not think. Green laughed sardonically. Shakespeare, he admitted, had written some scenes that were well enough, but he had taken them chiefly from Marlowe. Marlowe was a likely boy, but what could you say of a lad who died before he was 30? As for Browne, he was for writing poetry in prose, and people soon got tired of such conceits as that. Donne was a mountebank who wrapped up his lack of meaning in hard words. The gulls were taken in, but the style would be out of fashion 12 months hence. As for Ben Jonson was a friend of his, and he never spoke ill of his friends. No, concluded Green, the great age of literature is past. The great age of literature was the Greek. The Elizabethan age was inferior in every respect to the Greek. In such ages men cherished a divine ambition which he might call la gloire. He pronounced it glore, so that Orlando did not at first catch his meaning. Now all young writers were in the pay of the booksellers, and poured out any trash that would sell. Shakespeare was the chief offender in this way. So, my dear lord, said Green, we must make the best of it, cherish the past, and honour those writers, there are still a few of them, who take antiquity for their model, and write, not for pay, but for glore. Glore is the spur of noble minds. Had I a pension of £300 a year, paid quarterly, I would live for glore alone. I would lie in bed every morning reading Cicero. I would imitate his style so that you couldn't tell the difference between us. That's what I call fine writing. That's what I call glore. But it's necessary to have a pension to do it. So time passed, and Orlando felt for his guest a strange mixture of liking and contempt, of admiration and pity. Green talked incessantly about himself, yet with such good company that one could listen to the story of his ague forever. Even the maids, who despised him, tittered at his jokes, and the men-servants, who loathed him, hung about to hear his stories. Indeed, the house had never been so lively as now that he was there, all of which gave Orlando a great deal to think about, and caused him to compare this way of life with the old. Lying in bed of a morning on the softest pillows between the smoothest sheets, Nick Green thought that unless he could somehow make his escape, he should be smothered alive. Unless he could hear the drays roar upon the cobbles of Fleet Street, he would never write another line. So he sought Orlando in his room, and explained that he had not been able to sleep a wink all night because of the silence. Silence, he said, was of all things the most oppressive to his nerves. He would end his visit by Orlando's leave that very morning. Orlando felt some relief at this, yet also a great reluctance to let him go. The house, he thought, would seem very dull without him. On parting, Orlando had the temerity to press his play upon the death of Hercules upon the poet, and ask his opinion of it. The poet took it, muttered something about glore and Cicero, which Orlando cut short by promising to pay the pension quarterly, whereupon Green, with many protestations of affection, jumped into the coach and was gone. Nick Green was set down at the corner of Fetter Lane that same afternoon, and found things going on much as he had left them. This, he felt, was the atmosphere for writing, and write he did. The subject was made for him. A noble lord at home. A visit to a nobleman in the country. Seizing the pen, Green dashed off a very spirited satire there and then. It was so done to a turn that no one could doubt that the young lord was Orlando. His most private sayings and doings were there to the life. And if there had been any doubt about it, Green clinched the matter by introducing passages from that aristocratic tragedy, The Death of Hercules, which he found, as he expected, wordy and bombastic in the extreme. The pamphlet, which ran at once into several editions, was soon sent by friends to Orlando himself. When he had read it, which he did with deadly composure from start to finish, he rang for the footman, delivered the document to him at the end of a pair of tongs, and bade him drop it in the filthiest heart of the foulest midden on the estate. Then, when the man was turning to go, he stopped him. "Take the swiftest horse in the stable," he said. "Ride for dear life to Harwich. There embark upon a ship which you will find bound for Norway. Buy for me from the king's own kennels the finest elk hounds of the royal strain, male and female. Bring them back without delay. For," he said as he turned to his books, "I have done with men." The footman was back that day 3 weeks, leading in his hand a leash of the finest elk hounds, one of whom, a female, gave birth that very night to a litter of 8 fine puppies. Orlando had them brought to his bedchamber. "For," he said, "I have done with men." Nevertheless, he paid the pension quarterly. Thus, at the age of 30 or thereabouts, this young nobleman had not only had every experience that life has to offer, but had seen the worthlessness of them all. Love and ambition, women and poets were all equally vain. Literature was a farce. The night after reading Green's Visit to a Nobleman in the Country, he burnt 57 poetical works, only retaining The Oak Tree, which was his boyish dream, and very short. 2 things alone remained to him in which he now put any trust: dogs and nature. He called his hounds to him, and strode through the park. When he reached that high mound whence, on fine days, half of England, with a slice of Wales and Scotland thrown in, can be seen, he flung himself under his favourite oak tree, and felt that if he need never speak to another man or woman so long as he lived, he might make out what years remained to him in tolerable content. Here he came then, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Time passed, and nothing whatever happened. End of Side 1. Side 2. When a man has reached the age of 30, as Orlando now had, time when he is thinking becomes inordinately long, time when he is doing becomes inordinately short. Thus Orlando did the business of his vast estates in a flash, but directly he was alone on the mound under the oak tree, the seconds seemed as if they would never fall. For not only did he find himself confronted by problems which have puzzled the wisest of men, such as what is love, what friendship, what truth, but directly he came to think about them, his whole past, which seemed to him of extreme length and variety, rushed into the falling second, swelled it 12 times its natural size, coloured it 1,000 tints, and filled it with all the odds and ends in the universe. In such thinking he spent months and years of his life. It would be no exaggeration to say that he would go out after breakfast a man of 30, and come home to dinner a man of 55 at least. Some weeks added a century to his age, others no more than 3 seconds at most. Life seemed to him of prodigious length, yet even so it went like a flash. And as the first question had not been settled, what is love? Back it would come, and then he would try to think for half an hour, or was it 2 years and a half, how to say simply what love is. If literature, he said, is not the bride and bedfellow of truth, what is she? Confound it all, why say bedfellow when one's already said bride? Why not simply say what one means and leave it? So then he tried saying, the grass is green and the sky is blue. The sky is blue, he said, the grass is green. Looking up, he saw that, on the contrary, the sky is like the veils which 1,000 Madonnas have let fall from their hair, and the grass fleets and darkens like a flight of girls fleeing the embraces of hairy satyrs from enchanted woods. and he despaired of being able to solve the problem of what poetry is and what truth is, and fell into a deep dejection. In our belief, Nick Green's ridicule of his tragedy hurt him as much as the princess's ridicule of his love. At length, starting to his feet, it was now winter and very cold, Orlando said, "I'll be blasted if I ever write another word to please Nick Green or the Muse. Bad, good, or indifferent, I'll write from this day forward to please myself. Fame is like a braided coat which hampers the limbs, a jacket of silver which curbs the heart." Sunk for a long time in profound thoughts as to the value of obscurity and the delight of having no name, thinking how obscurity rids the mind of the irk of envy and spite, how it sets running in the veins the free waters of generosity and magnanimity, Orlando said, "What an admirable life this is, and why not enjoy it this very moment?" The thought struck him like a bullet. Rid of the heartburn of rejected love and of vanity rebuked, he opened his eyes, which had been wide open all the time, but had seen only thoughts, and saw, lying in the hollow beneath him, his house. There it lay in the early sunshine of spring, built circumspectly by a single architect with one idea in his head. Courts and buildings lay orderly and symmetrical. The courts were some of them oblong and some square. In this there was a fountain, in that a statue. All was clasped by the roll of a massive wall. This vast yet ordered building, which could house 1,000 men and perhaps 2,000 horses, was built, thought Orlando, by workmen whose names are unknown. Here have lived, for more centuries than I can count, the obscure generations of my own obscure family. Not one of these Richards, Johns, Annes, Elizabeths has left a token of himself behind him, yet all, working together, have left this. Never had the house looked more noble and humane. Why, then, had he wished to raise himself above them? For it seemed vain and arrogant in the extreme to try to better that anonymous work of creation, the labours of those vanished hands. Better was it to go unknown and leave behind you a potting shed, than to burn like a meteor and leave no dust. He would have liked to have ended his apostrophe with a flourish, to the effect that he would follow in their footsteps and add another stone to their building. Since, however, the building already covered 9 acres, to add even a single stone seemed superfluous. Leaving his speech unfinished for the moment, he strode downhill again, resolved henceforward to devote himself to the furnishing of the mansion. He set to work in earnest, and at length there was no room in the galleries for another table, no room on the tables for another cabinet, no room in the cabinet for another rose bowl, no room in the bowl for another handful of potpourri. There was no room for anything anywhere. In short, the house was furnished. In the garden, snowdrops, crocuses, hyacinths, magnolias, roses, lilies, asters, dahlias, pear trees and apple trees and cherry trees grew so thick on each other's roots that there was no plot of earth without its bloom. All now was ready, and when it was evening, and the innumerable silver sconces were lit, and the silver shone and lacquer glowed, Orlando walked through the house with his elk hounds following, and felt content. Yet he felt that still something was lacking. Chairs, however richly gilt and carved, are not by themselves enough. People sitting in them improve them amazingly. Accordingly, Orlando now began a series of very splendid entertainments to the nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood. The 365 bedrooms were full for a month at a time. Guests jostled each other on the 52 staircases. 300 servants bustled about the pantries. Banquets took place almost nightly. Thus, in a very few years, Orlando had spent the half of his fortune, but had earned the good opinion of his neighbours. He was excessively generous both to women and to poets, and both adored him. But when the feasting was at its height, he was apt to take himself off to his private room alone. There, when he was certain of privacy, he would have out an old writing book labelled in a round schoolboy hand, "The Oak Tree, a Poem." In this he would write till midnight chimed, and long after. He had changed his style amazingly. His floridity was chastened, his abundance curbed. The age of prose was congealing those warm fountains. Outside, the briars themselves were less intricate. Honey and cream were less seductive to the palate. Also, the fact that the streets were better drained and the houses better lit had its effect upon the style, it cannot be doubted. One day, a shadow crossed the tail of his eye. It was no shadow, he soon saw, but the figure of a very tall lady in riding hood and mantle crossing the quadrangle on which his room looked out. As this was the most private of the courts, and the lady was a stranger to him, Orlando marvelled how she had got there. 3 days later the same apparition appeared again, and on Wednesday noon appeared once more. This time Orlando was determined to follow her. She slackened her steps as he came up, and stared at him with a stare in which timidity and audacity were most strangely combined. First, she asked him to forgive her intrusion. Then, rising to her full height, which must have been something over 6 feet 2, she went on to say that she was the Archduchess Harriet Griselda of Finster Aarhorn and Scanboom in the Romanian territory. She desired above all things to make his acquaintance, she said. She had taken lodging over a baker's shop at the park gates. There was nothing for it but to ask her in and give her a glass of wine. Indoors, her manners regained the hauteur natural to a Romanian archduchess, and had she not shown a knowledge of wines rare in a lady, the talk would have lacked spontaneity. Jumping to her feet at last, she announced that she would call the following day, and departed. The following day Orlando rode out. The next he turned his back. On the third he drew his curtain. On the fourth it rained, and as he could not keep a lady in the wet, nor was altogether averse to company, he invited her in and asked her opinion whether a suit of armour was the work of Jacobi or of Top. He inclined to Top. She held another opinion. It matters very little which. But it is of some importance to the course of our story that, in illustrating her argument, the Archduchess Harriet took the golden shin-case and fitted it to Orlando's leg. That he had a pair of the shapeliest legs that any nobleman has ever stood upright upon has already been said. Perhaps something in the way she fastened the ankle-buckle, or her stooping posture, or Orlando's long seclusion, or the natural sympathy which is between the sexes, or the burgundy, or the fire. Any of these causes may have been to blame, for certainly blame there is on one side or another, when a nobleman of Orlando's breeding, entertaining a lady in his house, and she his elder by many years, is so suddenly and violently overcome by passion of some sort that he has to leave the room. But what sort of passion, it may well be asked, could this be? When the Archduchess Harriet Griselda stooped to fasten the buckle, Orlando heard far off the beating of love's wings. The distant stir of that soft plumage roused in him 1,000 memories of rushing waters, of loveliness in the snow, and faithlessness in the flood. And the sound came nearer, and he blushed and trembled, and he was moved as he had thought never to be moved again, and he was ready to raise his hands and let the bird of beauty alight upon his shoulders, when, horror, a creaking sound like that the crows make began to reverberate. The air seemed dark with coarse black wings. Voices croaked, bits of straw, twigs, and feathers dropped, and there pitched down upon his shoulders the heaviest and foulest of the birds, which is the vulture. Thus he rushed from the room, and sent the footman to see the Archduchess Harriet to her carriage. For it was lust, the vulture, not love, the bird of paradise, that flopped foully and disgustingly upon his shoulders. Hence he ran. But the harpy is not so easily banished as all that. Not only did the Archduchess continue to lodge at the baker's, but Orlando was haunted every day and night by phantoms of the foulest kind. Vainly, it seemed, he had furnished his house with silver, when at any moment a dung-bedraggled fowl could settle upon his writing table. Thus realizing that his house was uninhabitable, and that steps must be taken to end the matter instantly, he did what any other young man would have done in his place, and asked King Charles to send him as ambassador extraordinary to Constantinople. The king was walking in Whitehall. Nell Gwynn was on his arm. 'Twas 1,000 pities, that amorous lady sighed, that such a pair of legs should leave the country. Howbeit, she could do no more than toss one kiss over her shoulder before Orlando sailed. It is indeed highly unfortunate and much to be regretted that at this stage of Orlando's career, when he played a most important part in the public life of his country, we have least information to go upon. We know that he discharged his duties to admiration, witness his dukedom. But the revolution which broke out during his period of office, and the fire which followed, have so damaged or destroyed all those papers from which any trustworthy record could be drawn, that what we can give is lamentably incomplete. We have done our best to piece out a meagre summary from the charred fragments that remain, but often it has been necessary to speculate, to surmise, and even to use the imagination. Orlando's day was passed, it would seem, somewhat in this fashion. About 7 he would rise, wrap himself in a long Turkish cloak, light a cheroot, and lean his elbows on the parapet. Thus he would stand, gazing at the city beneath him, apparently entranced. At this hour the mist would lie so thick that the domes of Santa Sofia and the rest would seem to be afloat. Gradually the mist would uncover them. Soon the whole town would be astir with the cracking of whips, the beating of gongs, cryings to prayer, lashing of mules, and rattle of wheels. Nothing, he reflected, gazing at the view which was now sparkling in the sun, could well be less like the counties of Surrey and Kent, or the towns of London and Tunbridge Wells. To the right and left rose the inhospitable Asian mountains, to which the arid castle of a robber chief might hang. But parsonage there was none, nor manor house, nor oak, elm, or wild eglantine. The houses were white as eggshells and as bald. That he, who was English root and fibre, should yet exult to the depths of his heart in this wild panorama, surprised him. He wondered if, in the season of the Crusades, one of his ancestors had taken up with a Circassian peasant woman, thought it possible, fancied a certain darkness in his complexion, and going indoors again, withdrew to his bath. An hour later, properly scented, curled and anointed, he would receive visits from secretaries and other high officials till luncheon came, a splendid meal of perhaps 30 courses. After luncheon he went to call upon the other ambassadors and dignitaries of state. The ceremony was always the same. On reaching the courtyard, the main portal flew open, revealing a large chamber splendidly furnished. Here were seated 2 figures, generally of the opposite sexes. Profound bows and curtsies were exchanged. In the first room it was permissible only to mention the weather. Having said that it was fine or wet, hot or cold, the ambassador then passed on to the next chamber, where again 2 figures rose to greet him. Here it was only permissible to compare Constantinople as a place of residence with London, and the ambassador naturally said that he preferred Constantinople, and his hosts naturally said, though they had not seen it, that they preferred London. In the next chamber, King Charles's and the Sultan's healths had to be discussed at some length. In the next, the ambassador complimented his host upon his furniture, and the host complimented the ambassador upon his dress. The ceremony ended at length with the smoking of a hookah and the drinking of a glass of coffee, but though the motions of smoking and drinking were gone through punctiliously, there was neither tobacco in the pipe nor coffee in the glass, as, had either smoke or drink been real, the human frame would have sunk beneath the surfeit. For no sooner had the ambassador dispatched one such visit than another had to be undertaken. The same ceremonies were gone through in precisely the same order 6 or 7 times over at the houses of the other great officials, so that it was often late at night before the ambassador reached home. Though Orlando performed these tasks to admiration, he was undoubtedly fatigued by them, and often depressed to such a pitch of gloom that he preferred to take his dinner alone with his dogs. Sometimes, it is said, he would pass out of his own gates late at night, so disguised that the sentries did not know him. Then he would mingle with the crowd on the Galata bridge, or stroll through the bazaars. Once, when it was given out that he was ill of a fever, shepherds reported that they had met an English lord on the mountain top and heard him praying to his God. This was thought to be Orlando himself, and his prayer was, no doubt, a poem said aloud, for it was known that he still carried about with him in the bosom of his cloak a much-scored manuscript. It is with fragments such as these that we must do our best to make up a picture of Orlando's life and character at this time. But nobody has ever known exactly what took place late one night when the embassy was empty of company and shut up in the usual way. The ambassador was seen to go to his room and shut the door. Some say he locked it, which was against his custom. A washerwoman, who was kept awake by toothache, said that she saw a man's figure, wrapped in a cloak or dressing gown, come out upon the balcony. Then, she said, a woman, much muffled, but apparently of the peasant class, was drawn up by means of a rope which the man let down to her onto the balcony. There, the washerwoman said, they embraced passionately, like lovers, and went into the room together, drawing the curtains so that no more could be seen. Next morning, Orlando was found by his secretaries sunk in profound slumber amid bedclothes that were much tumbled. The room was in some disorder. The table was littered with papers. When afternoon came and he still slept, a doctor was summoned. He applied remedies, but without success. Orlando slept on. His secretaries then thought it their duty to examine the papers on the table. Many were scribbled over with poetry, in which frequent mention was made of an oak tree. There were also various state papers and others of a private nature concerning the management of his estates in England. But at length they came upon a document of far greater significance. It was nothing less, indeed, than a deed of marriage drawn up, signed and witnessed between his lordship, Orlando, Knight of the Garter, etc., etc., and Rosina Pepita, a dancer, father unknown, but reputed a gypsy, mother also unknown, but reputed a seller of old iron in the market-place. The secretaries looked at each other in dismay, and still Orlando slept. On the 7th day of his trance, Thursday, May the 10th, the first shot was fired of a terrible and bloody insurrection. The Turks rose against the Sultan, set fire to the town, and put every foreigner they could find either to the sword or to the bastinado. A few English managed to escape, but the gentlemen of the British Embassy preferred to die in defence of their red boxes. The rioters broke into Orlando's room, but seeing him stretched to all appearances dead, they left him untouched. And now obscurity descends, and would indeed that it were deeper. Would that it was so deep that we could see nothing whatever through its opacity. Would that we might here take the pen and write finis to our work. But here, alas, truth, candour, and honesty cry no. Putting their silver trumpets to their lips, they demand in one blast, truth, and again they cry, truth, and sounding yet a third time in concert, they blow one terrific blast, the truth, at which the sleeping Orlando woke. He stretched himself. He rose. He stood upright in complete nakedness before us, and we have no choice left but confess. He was a woman. Orlando stood stark naked. No human being since the world began has ever looked more ravishing. His form combined in one the strength of a man and a woman's grace. Orlando looked himself up and down in a long looking-glass, without showing any signs of discomposure, and went, presumably, to his bath. We may take advantage of this pause in the narrative to make certain statements. Orlando had become a woman, there is no denying it. But in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. The change of sex, though it altered their future, did nothing whatever to alter their identity. Their faces remained, as their portraits prove, practically the same. His memory, but in future we must, for convention's sake, say her for his and she for he, her memory, then, went back through all the events of her past life without encountering any obstacle. Some slight haziness there may have been, but that was all. The change seemed to have been accomplished painlessly and completely, and in such a way that Orlando herself showed no surprise at it. It is enough for us to state the simple fact. Orlando was a man until the age of 30, when he became a woman, and has remained so ever since. Orlando had now dressed herself in those Turkish coats and trousers which can be worn indifferently by either sex, and was forced to consider her position. It was precarious and embarrassing in the extreme. But Orlando showed no signs of perturbation. All her actions were deliberate, and might indeed have been thought to show tokens of premeditation. First, she carefully examined the papers on the table, took such as seemed to be written in poetry, and secreted them in her bosom. Next, she called her Saluki hound, fed and combed him. Then she stuck a pair of pistols in her belt, and finally wound about her person several strings of emeralds and pearls of the finest orient. This done, she descended the shattered and blood-stained staircase, and so entered the courtyard. There waited an old gypsy on a donkey. He led another by a bridle. Orlando swung her leg over it, and thus, attended by a lean dog, riding a donkey, in company of a gypsy, the ambassador of Great Britain at the court of the Sultan left Constantinople. Within a week they reached the high ground outside Brusa, which was then the chief camping ground of the gypsy tribe to which Orlando had allied herself. Often she had looked at these mountains from her balcony at the embassy, often had longed to be there. For some time, however, she was too well pleased with the change to spoil it by thinking. The pleasure of having no documents to seal or sign, no flourishes to make, no calls to pay, was enough. The gypsies followed the grass. When it was grazed down, on they moved again. She washed in streams if she washed at all. No boxes, red, blue, or green, were presented to her. There was not a key in the whole camp. She milked the goats, she collected brushwood, she trod the grape. And when she remembered how, at about this time of day, she should have been making the motions of drinking and smoking over an empty coffee cup and a pipe which lacked tobacco, she laughed aloud. The gypsies, with whom it is obvious that she must have been in secret communication before the Revolution, seemed to have looked upon her as one of themselves, which is always the highest compliment a people can pay. Thus, though in many ways inferior to them, they were willing to help her to become more like them. But Orlando had contracted in England some of the customs, or diseases, whatever you choose to consider them, which cannot, it seems, be expelled. One evening, when they were all sitting round the campfire and the sunset was blazing over the hills, Orlando exclaimed, "How good to eat!" The gypsies have no word for beautiful. This is the nearest. All the young men and women burst out laughing. The sky good to eat, indeed. The elders, however, who had seen more of foreigners than they had, became suspicious. They noticed that Orlando often sat for whole hours doing nothing whatever. They would come upon her on some hilltop, staring straight in front of her, no matter whether the goats were grazing or straying. They began to suspect that she had other beliefs than their own, and the older men and women thought it probable that she had fallen into the clutches of nature. Nor were they far wrong. The English disease, a love of nature, was inborn in her, and here, where nature was so much larger and more powerful than in England, she fell into its hands as she had never done before. She climbed the mountains, roamed the valleys. She likened the hills to ramparts, to the breasts of doves and the flanks of kine. She compared the flowers to enamel, and the turf to rugs worn thin. Trees were withered hags, and sheep were grey boulders. Everything, in fact, was something else. Returning home, she flung herself upon her mat in the gypsy's tent, and could not help bursting out again. How good to eat! All the young gypsies laughed. But Rustam el-Sadi, the old man who had brought Orlando out of Constantinople, sat silent. He had the deepest suspicion that her god was nature. One day he found her in tears. Interpreting this to mean that her god had punished her, he told her that he was not surprised. He showed her the fingers of his left hand, withered by the frost. He showed her his right foot, crushed where a rock had fallen. This, he said, was what her god did to men. When she said, "But so beautiful," using the English word, he shook his head. And when she repeated it, he was angry. He saw that she did not believe what he believed, and that was enough, wise and ancient as he was, to enrage him. This difference of opinion disturbed Orlando, who had been perfectly happy until now. She began to think, was nature beautiful or cruel? And then she asked herself what this beauty was, whether it was in things themselves or only in herself. So she went on to the nature of reality, which led her to truth, which in its turn led to love, friendship, poetry, as in the days on the high mound at home. Which meditations, since she could impart no word of them, made her long for pen and ink. She made ink from berries and wine, and finding a few margins and blank spaces in the manuscript of the oak tree, managed to carry on a dialogue with herself about this beauty and truth. This kept her extremely happy for hours on end. But the gypsies became suspicious. They noticed that she was less adept than before at milking and cheese-making. Then an old woman making a basket, a boy skinning a sheep, would be crooning contentedly at their work, when Orlando would come into the camp, fling herself down by the fire, and gaze into the flames. Here, said the gypsies, is someone who doubts. Here is someone who does not do the thing for the sake of doing, nor looks for looking's sake. Here is someone who believes neither in sheepskin nor basket, but sees, here they looked apprehensively about the tent, something else. Then a vague but most unpleasant feeling would begin to work in the boy and in the old woman. They broke their withes, they cut their fingers. A great rage filled them. They wished Orlando would leave the tent and never come near them again. Yet she was of a cheerful and willing disposition, they owned, and one of her pearls was enough to buy the finest herd of goats in Brusa. Slowly Orlando began to feel that there was some difference between her and the gypsies which made her hesitate sometimes to marry and settle down among them forever. One night, when they were questioning her about England, she could not help with some pride describing the house where she was born, how it had 365 bedrooms, and had been in the possession of her family for 400 or 500 years. Her ancestors were earls or even dukes, she added. At this she noticed again that the gypsies were uneasy. Rustam followed her out of the tent alone, and said that she need not mind if her father were a duke, and possessed all the bedrooms and furniture that she described. They would none of them think the worse of her for that. Then she was seized with a shame that she had never felt before. It was clear that Rustam and the other gypsies thought a descent of 400 or 500 years only the meanest possible. Their own families went back at least 2,000 or 3,000 years. To the gypsy whose ancestors had built the pyramids centuries before Christ was born, the genealogy of Howards and Plantagenets was no better and no worse than that of the Smiths and the Joneses. Both were negligible. Moreover, it was clear that the gypsy thought that there was no more vulgar ambition than to possess bedrooms by the 100 when the whole earth is ours. Looked at from the gypsy point of view, A duke was nothing but a profiteer who snatched land and could think of nothing better to do than to build 365 bedrooms when one was enough and none was even better than one. She sought to answer such arguments by the familiar, if oblique, method of finding the gypsy life itself rude and barbarous, and so in a short time much bad blood was bred between them. 476 bedrooms mean nothing to them, said Orlando. She prefers a sunset to a flock of goats, said the gypsies. At this, Orlando burst into a passion of tears and told the gypsies that she must sail for England. It was happy for her that she did so. Already the young men had plotted her death. Honour, they said, demanded it, for she did not think as they did. Yet they would have been sorry to cut her throat, and welcomed the news of her departure. Orlando, by breaking off another pearl from her necklace, not only paid her passage, but had some banknotes left over in her wallet. These she would have liked to present to the gypsies. But they despised wealth, she knew, and she had to content herself with embraces, which on her part were sincere. With some of the guineas left from the sale of the 10th pearl on her string, Orlando bought herself a complete outfit of such clothes as women then wore, and it was in the dress of a young English woman of rank that she now sat on the deck of the enamoured lady. It is a strange fact, but a true one, that up to this moment she had scarcely given her sex a thought. It was not until the captain offered, with the greatest politeness, to have an awning spread for her on deck, that she realized with a start the penalties and the privileges of her position. But that start was not of the kind that might have been expected. It was not caused, that is to say, simply and solely by the thought of her chastity and how she could preserve it. In normal circumstances, a lovely young woman alone would have thought of nothing else. But if one has been a man for 30 years or so, and one has held a queen in one's arms, and one or two other ladies of less exalted rank, one does not perhaps give such a very great start about that. Orlando's start was of a very complicated kind, and not to be summed up in a trice. It took her the entire length of the voyage to moralize out the meaning of her start, and so, at her own pace, we will follow her. Lord, she thought, when she had recovered from her start, stretching herself out at length under her awning, this is a pleasant, lazy way of life, to be sure. But these skirts are plaguy things to have about one's heels. Could I leap overboard and swim in clothes like these? No. Therefore I should have to trust to the protection of a blue jacket. Do I object to that? Now do I? Dinner came, and the captain helped her to a slice of corned beef. "A little of the fat, ma'am," he said. "Let me cut you just the tiniest little slice the size of your fingernail." At those words a delicious tremor ran through her frame. It recalled the feeling of indescribable pleasure with which she had first seen Sasha, hundreds of years ago. Then she had pursued, now she fled. Which is the greater ecstasy, the man's or the woman's? And are they not perhaps the same? No, she thought, this is the most delicious, thanking the captain, but refusing. To refuse, and see him frown. Well, she would, if he wished it, have the very thinnest, smallest shiver in the world. This was the most delicious of all, to yield and see him smile. For nothing, she thought, regaining her couch on deck, is more heavenly than to resist and to yield and to resist. She remembered how, as a young man, she had insisted that women must be obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled. Now, she said, I shall have to pay in my own person for those desires, for women are not obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled by nature. They can only attain these graces, without which they may enjoy none of the delights of life, by the most tedious discipline. There's the hair-dressing, that alone will take an hour of my morning. There's washing and powdering, there's being chaste year in, year out. Here she tossed her foot impatiently and showed an inch or two of calf. A sailor on the mast, who happened to look down at the moment, started so violently that he missed his footing and only saved himself by the skin of his teeth. "If," said Orlando, "the sight of my ankles means death to an honest fellow, who, no doubt, has a wife and family to support, I must, in all humanity, keep them covered." Yet her legs were among her chiefest beauties. And she fell to thinking what an odd pass we have come to when all a woman's beauty has to be kept covered, lest a sailor may fall from a masthead. "A pox on them," she said, realizing for the first time what she would have been taught as a child, that is to say, the sacred responsibilities of womanhood. "And that's the last oath I shall ever be able to swear," she said, "once I set foot on English soil. And I shall never be able to crack a man over the head, or tell him he lies in his teeth, or draw my sword and run him through the body, or walk in procession, or wear 72 different medals on my breast. All I can do, once I set foot on English soil, is to pour out tea and ask my lords how they like it. Do you take sugar? Do you take cream?" And she was horrified to perceive how low an opinion she was forming of the other sex, the manly, to which it had once been her pride to belong. "To fall from a masthead," she said, "because you see a woman's ankles. To dress up like a Guy Fawkes and parade the streets so that women may praise you. To deny a woman teaching lest she may laugh at you. Heavens! What fools they make of us! What fools we are!" And here it would seem, from some ambiguity in her terms, that she was censuring both sexes equally, as if she belonged to neither. And indeed, for the time being, she seemed to vacillate. She was man. She was woman. She knew the secrets, shared the weaknesses of each. Here she gave a great yawn and fell asleep. When she woke, the ship was sailing before a fair breeze. Stretching her arms out, arms, she had learned already, have no such fatal effects as legs, she thanked heaven that she was not prancing down Whitehall on a war-horse. "Better is it," she said, "to be clothed with poverty and ignorance, which are the dark garments of the female sex. Better to leave the rule and discipline of the world to others. Better be quit of martial ambition, the love of power, and all the other manly desires, if so one can more fully enjoy the most exalted raptures known to the human spirit, which are contemplation, solitude, love. Praise God that I'm a woman." Then she paused over the singular word which crept in at the end of the last sentence. "Love." "Love," said Orlando. Instantly, such is its impetuosity, love took a human shape. Such is its pride. And as all Orlando's loves had been women, now, though she herself was a woman, it was still a woman she loved. And if the consciousness of being of the same sex had any effect at all, it was to quicken and deepen those feelings which she had had as a man. For now the obscurity which divides the sexes and lets linger innumerable impurities in its gloom was removed. At last, she cried, she knew Sasha as she was. And in the ardour of this discovery, and in the pursuit of all those treasures which were now revealed, she was so rapt and enchanted that it was as if a cannon-ball had exploded at her ear when a man's voice said, "Permit me, madam." A man's hand raised her to her feet, and the fingers of a man pointed to the horizon. "The cliffs of England, ma'am," said the captain, and Orlando now gave a second start, even more violent than the first. Christ Jesus! Happily, the sight of her native land after long absence excused both start and exclamation. How tell him that she, who now trembled on his arm, had been a duke and an ambassador? How explain to him that she had hacked heads off and lain with loose women in the holds of pirate ships? "To refuse and to yield," she said. "How delightful! To pursue and to conquer, how august. To perceive and to reason, how sublime. Nevertheless, as the chalky cliffs loomed nearer, she felt culpable, dishonoured, unchaste. Closer and closer they drew, and she felt, scampering up and down within her, Sasha the lost, Sasha the memory. And she felt that however much landing meant comfort, meant opulence, meant consequence and state, still, if it meant conventionality, meant slavery, meant deceit, meant denying her love, fettering her limbs, pursing her lips and restraining her tongue, then she would turn about with the ship and set sail once more for the gypsies. Among the hurry of these thoughts, however, there now rose something which recalled that earliest, most persistent memory. The man with the big forehead in that sitting-room, the man who sat writing, or rather looking, but certainly not at her. Now her hand went to her bosom, where the pages of her poem were hidden safe. The distraction of sex subsided. She thought now only of the glory of poetry, and the great lines of Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Milton began booming and reverberating. Orlando hung over the prow, absorbed in wonder. That, then, was the dome of St. Paul's, which Mr. Wren had built during her absence. Nearby, a shock of golden hair burst from a pillar. The captain was at her side to inform her that that was the monument. There had been a plague and a fire during her absence, he said. Here, she thought, had been the great carnival. Here she had first met Sasha. Here, where yellow icebergs had raced, a covey of swans floated. London itself had completely changed since she had last seen it. Then, she remembered, it had been a huddle of little black beetle-browed houses. The cobbled pavements had reeked of garbage and ordure. Now she caught glimpses of broad and orderly thoroughfares. Stately coaches drawn by teams of well-fed horses stood at the doors of houses, whose bow windows, whose plate glass, testified to the wealth and modest dignity of the dwellers within. Ladies in flowered silk walked on raised footpaths. Citizens in braided coats took snuff at street corners under lamp-posts. She caught sight of a variety of painted signs, and could form a rapid notion of the tobacco, of the silk, of the gold which was sold within. Nor could she do more than glance at coffee-house windows, where, on balconies, since the weather was fine, a great number of decent citizens sat at ease, with china dishes in front of them, clay pipes by their sides, while one among them read from a news-sheet. Were these poets? She asked of the captain, who obligingly informed her that even now, if she turned her head a little, they were passing the cocoa tree, where, yes, there he was, one might see Mr. Addison taking his coffee. The other two gentlemen were Mr. Dryden and Mr. Pope. Addison, Dryden, Pope, said Orlando. For one moment she saw the high mountains above Broussa. The next, she had set her foot upon her native shore. End of Side 2. Side 3. No sooner had Orlando returned to her home in Blackfriars than she was made aware by a succession of grave emissaries from the law courts that she was a party to 3 major suits which had been preferred against her during her absence, as well as innumerable minor litigations. The chief charges against her were 1. That she was dead, and therefore could not hold any property whatsoever. 2. That she was a woman, which amounts to much the same thing. 3. That she was an English duke who had married one Rosina Pepita, a dancer, and had had by her 3 sons, which sons, now declaring that their father was deceased, claimed that all his property descended to them. Such grave charges as these would, of course, take time and money to dispose of. All her estates were put in chancery, and her titles pronounced in abeyance while the suits were under litigation. Thus it was in a highly ambiguous condition that she posted down to her country seat, where, pending the legal judgment, she had the law's permission to reside in a state of incognito, or incognita, as the case might turn out to be. It was a fine evening in December when she arrived, and the snow was falling. She had not time to reach her hand towards the knocker, before both wings of the great door were flung open, and there, with lights and torches held above their heads, was the whole retinue of servants come to greet her. But the orderly procession was interrupted first by the impetuosity of Canute, the elk-hound, who threw himself with such ardour upon his mistress that he almost knocked her to the ground. No one showed an instant's suspicion that Orlando was not the Orlando they had known. If any doubt there was in the human mind, the action of the dogs would have been enough to dispel it. For dumb creatures, as is well known, are far better judges both of identity and character than we are. Moreover, said Mrs. Grimsditch that night, if her lord was a lady now, she had never seen a lovelier one. So, while the old servants gossiped in the servants' hall, Orlando took a candle and roamed once more through the halls, the galleries, the courts, the bedrooms. At length, tired out, she entered the chapel and sank into the old red armchair in which her ancestors used to hear service. There she lit a cheroot. 'Twas a habit she had brought back from the East, and opened the prayer book. "I am growing up," she said. "I am losing some illusions, perhaps to acquire others." And she descended among the tombs where the bones of her ancestors lay. But even the bones of her ancestors had lost something of their sanctity since Rustam el-Sadi had waved his hand that night in the Asian mountains. Somehow the fact that only 300 or 400 years ago these skeletons had been men with their way to make in the world like any modern upstart, and that they had made it by acquiring houses and offices, garters and ribbons, filled her with remorse. "I am growing up," she said. "I am losing my illusions, perhaps to acquire new ones." And she paced down the long gallery to her bedroom, and reviewed the progress of her own self along her own past. How she had loved sound when she was a boy, and thought the volley of tumultuous syllables from the lips the finest of all poetry. Then, it was the effect of Sasha and her disillusionment perhaps, there had slowly opened within her something intricate. Here, in solitude, after her affair with Green, she had tried to form a spirit capable of resistance. "I will write," she had said, "what I enjoy writing," and so had scratched out 26 volumes. Yet still, for all her travels and adventures, she was only in process of fabrication. What the future might bring, heaven only knew. Here she went to the window, and in spite of the cold could not help unlatching it. She leant out into the damp night air. "By my life," she said, "this is 1,000 times better than Turkey. Rustam, you were wrong. What a phantasmagoria the mind is. At one moment we deplore our birth and state, and aspire to an ascetic exaltation. The next we are overcome by the smell of some old garden path, and weep to hear the thrushes sing." And she threw her cheroot out of the window, and went to bed. Next morning, in pursuance of these thoughts, she had out her pen and paper, and started afresh upon the oak tree, when a shadow darkened the page. As she had given orders that she would see no one, she was at first surprised at the shadow, then indignant at it, then, when she looked up and saw what caused it, overcome with merriment. For it was a familiar shadow, the shadow of no less a personage than the Archduchess Harriet Griselda of Finster Ahorn and Scandup Boom in the Romanian territory. She was loping across the court in her old black riding habit and mantle as before. Not a hair of her head was changed. This then was the woman who had chased her from England. At the thought that she had fled all the way to Turkey to avoid her seductions, Orlando laughed aloud. There was nothing for it but to ask her in, and soon the two ladies were exchanging compliments. "A plague on women," said Orlando to herself, going to the cupboard to fetch a glass of wine. "They never leave one a moment's peace. A more busybodying set of people don't exist. It was to escape this maypole that I left England, and now—" Here she turned to present the Archduchess with a salver, and behold, in her place stood a tall gentleman in black. A heap of clothes lay in the fender. She was alone with a man. Recalled thus suddenly to a consciousness of her sex, which she had completely forgotten, and of his, which was now remote enough to be equally upsetting, Orlando felt seized with faintness. "La!" she cried, "how you frighten me!" "Gentle creature," said the Archduchess, falling on one knee, "forgive me for the deceit I have practised on you." Orlando sipped the wine, and the Archduke kissed her hand. In short, they acted the parts of man and woman for 10 minutes with great vigour, and then fell into natural discourse. The Archduke told his story, that he was a man, and always had been one, that he had seen a portrait of Orlando and fallen hopelessly in love with him, that to compass his ends he had dressed as a woman, that he was desolated when he fled to Turkey, that he had heard of her change. For to him, said the Archduke Harry, she was the perfection of her sex. "If this is love," said Orlando to herself, looking from the woman's point of view, "there is something highly ridiculous about it." Falling on his knees, the Archduke Harry made the most passionate declaration of his suit. He told her that he had something like 20 million ducats in a strong-box at his castle in Romania. He had more acres than any nobleman in England. As he spoke, enormous tears formed in his rather prominent eyes. That men cry as frequently and as unreasonably as women, Orlando knew from her own experience as a man, but she was beginning to be aware that women should be shocked when men display emotion in their presence, and so shocked she was. The Archduke apologized. He commanded himself sufficiently to say that he would leave her now, but would return on the following day for an answer. That was a Tuesday. He came on Wednesday, he came on Thursday, he came on Friday, and he came on Saturday. It is true that each visit began, continued, or concluded with a declaration of love, but in between there was much room for silence. They sat on either side of the fireplace, and sometimes the Archduke knocked over the fire-irons, and Orlando picked them up again. Then the Archduke would say, "I adore you," at the very same moment that Orlando said, "Look, it's beginning to rain," at which they were both much embarrassed and blushed scarlet, and could neither of them think what to say next. Orlando was at her wits' end what to talk about, and bethought her of a game called Fly-Loo, at which great sums can be lost with very little expense of spirit. The Archduke would bet her £500 that a fly would settle on this lump of sugar and not on that. But Orlando soon began to weary. "What's the good of being a fine young woman in the prime of life," she said, "if I have to pass all my mornings watching blue bottles with an Archduke?" She began to detest the sight of sugar. Flies made her dizzy. Some way out of the difficulty there must be, she supposed, and could think of no better method than this. She caught a blue bottle and secured it by a drop of gum arabic to a lump of sugar. While the Archduke was gazing at the ceiling, she deftly substituted this lump for the one she'd laid her money on, and crying, "Loo! Loo!" declared that she had won her bet. A painful scene ensued. The Archduke rose to his full height. He coloured scarlet. That she had won a fortune from him was nothing. She was welcome to it. But that she had cheated at loo was everything. To love a woman who cheated at play was, he said, impossible. Here he broke down completely. Happily, he said, recovering slightly, there were no witnesses. She was, after all, only a woman, he said. In short, he was preparing, in the chivalry of his heart, to forgive her, and had bent to ask her pardon when she cut the matter short by dropping a small toad between his skin and his shirt. In justice to her, it must be said that she would infinitely have preferred a rapier. But if rapiers are forbidden, one must have recourse to toads. Moreover, toads and laughter between them sometimes do what cold steel cannot. She laughed. The Archduke blushed. She laughed. The Archduke cursed. She laughed. The Archduke slammed the door. "Heaven be praised," said Orlando, still laughing. She heard the sound of chariot wheels driven at a furious pace down the courtyard. She heard them rattle along the road. Fainter and fainter the sound became. Now it faded away altogether. "I am alone," said Orlando, aloud, since there was no one to hear. She rang the bell and ordered a coach and six to be in readiness instantly. Within an hour of the Archduke's departure, off she drove to London. She took up her lodging at her father's house in Blackfriars, which was still a pleasant, roomy mansion with gardens running down to the river. Next day she found on her breakfast table 6 billets from some of the greatest ladies in the land: Lady Suffolk, Lady Salisbury, Lady Chesterfield, Lady Tavistock, and others who reminded her in the politest manner of old alliances between their families and her own, and desired the honour of her acquaintance. The following day, which was a Saturday, many of these great ladies waited on her in person. On Tuesday, about noon, their footman brought cards of invitation to various assemblies in the near future, so that Orlando was launched without delay, and with some splash and foam at that, upon the waters of London society. Society in the reign of Queen Anne was of unparalleled brilliance. To have the entry there was the aim of every well-bred person. The graces were supreme. Since Orlando had won the praise of Queen Elizabeth for the way she handled a bowl of rose-water as a boy, it must be supposed that she was sufficiently expert to pass muster. Yet it is true that there was an absent-mindedness about her which sometimes made her clumsy. She was apt to think of poetry when she should have been thinking of taffeta. Her walk was a little too much of a stride for a woman, perhaps, and her gestures, being abrupt, might endanger a cup of tea on occasion. Whether or not this slight disability was enough to counterbalance the splendour of her bearing, certain it is that she had not been in the world more than a score of times before she might have been heard to ask herself, "What the devil is the matter with me?" The occasion was Tuesday, the 16th of June, 1712. She had just returned from a great ball at Arlington House. The dawn was in the sky, and she was pulling off her stockings. "I don't care if I never meet another soul as long as I live," she said, bursting into tears. Lovers she had in plenty, but life escaped her. "Is this," she said, "what people call life?" Orlando went to bed, determined that she would forswear society forever. But again, as it turned out, she was too hasty in coming to her conclusions. For the very next morning she woke to find, among the usual cards of invitation upon her table, one from a certain great lady, the Countess of R. Having determined overnight that she would never go into society again, we can only explain Orlando's behaviour. She sent a messenger hot foot to say that she would attend her ladyship with all the pleasure in the world, by the fact that she was still suffering from the effect of 3 honeyed words dropped into her ear by the captain of the enamoured lady: Addison, Dryden, Pope. Addison, Dryden, Pope had chimed in her head like an incantation ever since. All her experience with Nick Green had taught her nothing. Such names still exercised over her the most powerful fascination. Now, the Lady R's reception-room had the reputation of being the antechamber to the presence-room of genius. Intellect alone admitted the suppliant, and nothing, so the report ran, was said inside that was not witty. It was thus with great trepidation that Orlando entered the room. She found a company already assembled in a semicircle round the fire. Lady R was seated in a great armchair in the centre. Thus, being somewhat deaf, she could control the conversation on both sides of her. On both sides of her sat men and women of the highest distinction. Every man, it was said, had been a prime minister, and every woman, it was whispered, had been the mistress of a king. Certain it is that all were brilliant, and all were famous. Orlando took her seat with a deep reverence, in silence. After 3 hours, she curtsied profoundly and left. But what happened in between? In 3 hours, such a company must have said the wittiest, the profoundest, the most interesting things in the world. So it would seem indeed. But the fact appears to be that they said nothing. The guests thought that they were witty, thought that they were profound, and as they thought this, other people thought it still more strongly. And so it got about that nothing was more delightful than one of Lady R's assemblies. Everyone envied those who were admitted. Those who were admitted envied themselves because other people envied them. And so there seemed no end to it, except that which we have now to relate. For about the 3rd time Orlando went there, a certain incident occurred. She was still under the illusion that she was listening to the most brilliant epigrams in the world, though, as a matter of fact, old General C was only saying, at some length, how the gout had left his left leg and gone to his right, while Mr. L, when any proper name was mentioned, interrupted with, "R? Oh, I know Billy R as well as I know myself. S? My dearest friend. T? Stayed with him a fortnight in Yorkshire." This, such is the force of illusion, sounded like the wittiest repartee, the most searching comment upon human life. Then the door opened, and a little gentleman entered, whose name Orlando did not catch. Soon a curiously disagreeable sensation came over her. To judge from their faces, the rest began to feel it as well. One gentleman said there was a draught. The Marchioness of C feared a cat must be under the sofa. It was as if their eyes were being slowly opened after a pleasant dream, and nothing met them but a cheap washstand. Everybody fidgeted, and those who had fans yawned behind them. At last Lady R rapped hers upon the arm of her great chair. Both gentlemen stopped talking. Then the little gentleman said. He said next. He said finally. These sayings are too well known to require repetition, and besides they are all to be found in his published works. Here, it cannot be denied, was true wit, true wisdom, true profundity. The company was thrown into complete dismay. One such saying was bad enough, but 3, one after another, on the same evening. No society could survive it. "Mr. Pope," said old Lady R, trembling with sarcastic fury, "you are pleased to be witty." Mr. Pope flushed red. Nobody spoke a word. They sat in dead silence some 20 minutes. Then, one by one, they rose and slunk from the room. Doors were slammed, and carriages drove off. Orlando found herself near Mr. Pope on the staircase. He looked like some squat reptile with a burning topaz in its forehead. At the same time, the strangest tempest of emotion seized now upon the luckless Orlando. A disillusionment so complete as that inflicted not an hour ago leaves the mind rocking from side to side. Everything appears 10 times more bare and stark than before. It is a moment fraught with the highest danger for the human spirit. Women turn nuns and men priests in such moments. In such moments, rich men sign away their wealth, and happy men cut their throats. Orlando would have done all willingly, but there was a rasher thing still for her to do, and this she did. She invited Mr. Pope to come home with her. Orlando now began to live much in the company of men of genius. Nor were they so different from the rest of us as one might have supposed. Addison, Pope, Swift proved to be fond of tea. They collected little bits of coloured glass. They wore plum-coloured suits one day, and grey another. Mr. Swift had a fine Malacca cane. Mr. Addison scented his handkerchiefs. Mr. Pope suffered with his head. A piece of gossip did not come amiss. At first she was annoyed with herself for noticing such trifles, and kept a book in which to write down their memorable sayings, but the page remained empty. All the same, her spirits revived, and she took to tearing up her cards of invitation to great parties, kept her evenings free, began to look forward to Mr. Pope's visit, to Mr. Addison's, to Mr. Swift's. So Orlando poured out tea for them all, and sometimes, when the weather was fine, she carried them down to the country with her and feasted them royally in the round parlour. They were very witty, too, but their wit is all in their books, and taught her the most important part of style, which is the natural run of the voice in speaking, a quality which none that has not heard it can imitate, not Green even, with all his skill, for it is born of the air, and breaks like a wave on the furniture, and rolls and fades away, and is never to be recaptured. They taught her this, merely by the cadence of their voices in speech, so that her style changed somewhat, and she wrote some very pleasant witty verses and characters in prose. And so she lavished her wine on them, and put bank-notes, which they took very kindly, beneath their plates at dinner, and accepted their dedications, and thought herself highly honoured by the exchange. Thus time ran on, and Orlando could often be heard saying to herself, with an emphasis which might perhaps make the hearer a little suspicious, "Upon my soul, what a life this is!" One day she was pouring out tea for Mr. Pope. "Lord," she thought, as she raised the sugar tongs, "how women in ages to come will envy me." And let us finish her thought for her, for when anybody says how future ages will envy me, it is safe to say that they are extremely uneasy at the present moment. Was this life quite so exciting, quite so glorious as it sounds when the memoir writer has done his work upon it? For one thing, Orlando had a positive hatred of tea. For another, the intellect has a habit of lodging in the most seedy of carcasses, and often, alas, acts the cannibal among the other faculties, so that often, where the mind is biggest, the heart, the senses, tolerance, kindliness, and the rest of them scarcely have room to breathe. Added to which there is a little secret which men share among them. Lord Chesterfield whispered it to his son. "Women are but children of a larger growth. A man of sense only trifles with them, plays with them, humours and flatters them." A woman knows very well that, though a wit sends her his poems, praises her judgment, solicits her criticism, and drinks her tea, this by no means signifies that he respects her opinion, admires her understanding, or will refuse, though the rapier is denied him, to run her through the body with his pen. Orlando let the sugar fall with a great plop into Mr. Pope's tea. Never was any mortal so ready to suspect an insult as Mr. Pope. He turned to Orlando and presented her instantly with a rough draft of a certain famous line in the Characters of Women. Orlando received it with a curtsy. Mr. Pope left her with a bow. Orlando, to cool her cheeks, for really she felt as if the little man had struck her, strolled in the grove at the bottom of the garden. Soon the cool breezes did their work. To her amazement she found that she was hugely relieved to find herself alone. She sat herself down in profound meditation beneath a fine willow tree. There she sat till the stars were in the sky. Then she rose, turned, and went into the house, where she sought her bedroom and locked the door. Now she opened a cupboard in which hung still many of the clothes she had worn as a young man of fashion, and from among them she chose a black velvet suit richly trimmed with Venetian lace. It was a little out of fashion, indeed, but it fitted her to perfection, and dressed in it she looked the very figure of a noble lord. She took a turn or two before the mirror, and then let herself secretly out of doors. She entered Leicester Square, and saw a young woman who sat dejectedly beneath a plane tree in the middle of the square. Orlando swept her hat off to her, in the manner of a gallant paying his addresses to a lady of fashion in a public place. The young woman raised her head, and accepted Orlando's arm. For, need we stress the point, she was of the tribe which nightly burnishes their wares and waits the highest bidder. She led Orlando to the room in Gerrard Street, which was her lodging. To feel her hanging lightly, yet like a suppliant on her arm, roused in Orlando all the feelings which become a man. She looked, she felt, she talked like one. Upstairs they went, and Nell, as the girl called herself, unbuttoned her gloves, all the time prattling, as women do, to amuse her lover. Orlando could stand it no longer. in the strangest torment of anger, merriment, and pity, she flung off all disguise and admitted herself a woman. At this, Nell burst into such a roar of laughter as might have been heard across the way. "Well, my dear, I am by no means sorry to hear it. For the plain danstable of the matter is, I am not in the mood for the society of the other sex tonight." Whereupon, drawing up the fire and stirring a bowl of punch, she told Orlando the whole story of her life. Nell brought Prue, and Prue Kitty, and Kitty Rose, for they had a society of their own, of which they now elected Orlando a member. Many were the fine tales they told, and many the amusing observations they made, for it cannot be denied that when women get together, all they desire is— But hist! Is that not a man's step on the stair? "Women have no desires," says this gentleman, coming into Nell's parlour. "Only affectations." "It is well known," says Mr. S.W., "that when they lack the stimulus of the other sex, women can find nothing to say to each other." And Mr. T.R. has proved that women are incapable of any feeling of affection for their own sex, and hold each other in the greatest aversion. Let us pass this over, and merely state that Orlando professed great enjoyment in the society of her own sex, and leave it to the gentleman to prove that this is impossible. But to give an exact and particular account of Orlando's life at this time becomes more and more out of the question. The task is made still more difficult by the fact that she found it convenient at this time to change frequently from one set of clothes to another. Thus she often occurs in contemporary memoirs as Lord So-and-so. She had, it seems, no difficulty in sustaining the different parts, for her sex changed far more frequently than those who have worn only one set of clothing can conceive. Nor can there be any doubt that she reaped a twofold harvest by this device. The pleasures of life were increased, and its experiences multiplied. For the probity of breeches, she exchanged the seductiveness of petticoats, and enjoyed the love of both sexes equally. So then one may sketch her, spending her morning in a robe of ambiguous gender among her books, then receiving a client or two in the same garment. Then she would take a turn in the garden and clip the nut trees, for which knee breeches were convenient. Then she would change into a flowered taffeta, which best suited a drive to Richmond and a proposal of marriage from some great nobleman, and so back again to town, where she would don a snuff-coloured gown like a lawyer's, and visit the courts to hear how her cases were doing, for her fortune was wasting hourly, and the suits seemed no nearer consummation than they had been 100 years ago. And so, finally, when night came, she would more often than not become a nobleman, complete from head to toe, and walk the streets in search of adventure. Never was any play so absorbing. She wanted to cry out, "Bravo! Bravo!" For, to be sure, what a fine drama it was! What a page torn from the thickest volume of human life! At length, she came home one night after one of these saunterings, and mounted to her bedroom. She took off her laced coat, and stood there in shirt and breeches looking out of the window. There was something stirring in the air which forbade her to go to bed. She remembered the city of London in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, a mere huddle and conglomeration of houses, under her windows at Blackfriars. The stars reflected themselves in deep pits of stagnant water, which lay in the middle of the streets. A black shadow at the corner was, as likely as not, the corpse of a murdered man. She could remember the cries of many a one wounded in such night brawlings, when she was a little boy, held to the diamond-paned window, in her nurse's arms. On such a night as this, the impermeable tangle of the forests on Highgate and Hampstead would be outlines against the sky. Here and there, on one of the hills which rose above London, was a stark gallows tree with a corpse nailed to rot, for danger and insecurity swarmed over the tortuous Elizabethan highways, and buzzed and stank in the narrow pathways of the city. Now she leant out of her window. All was light, order, and serenity. There was the faint rattle of a coach on the cobbles. She heard the far-away cry of the night watchman. "Just 12 o'clock on a frosty morning." No sooner had the words left his lips than the first stroke of midnight sounded. Orlando then, for the first time, noticed a small cloud gathered behind the dome of St. Paul's. As the strokes sounded, the cloud increased, and she saw it darken and spread with extraordinary speed. By the time the sixth stroke of midnight had struck, the whole of the eastern sky was covered with an irregular moving darkness. Then the cloud spread north. As the 9th, 10th, and 11th strokes struck, a huge blackness sprawled over the whole of London. With the 12th stroke of midnight, the darkness was complete. A turbulent welter of cloud covered the city. All was darkness. All was doubt. All was confusion. The 18th century was over. The 19th century had begun. The great cloud which hung not only over London but over the whole of the British Isles on the first day of the 19th century stayed long enough to have extraordinary consequences upon those who lived beneath its shadow. A change seemed to have come over the climate of England. Rain fell frequently. Damp now began to make its way into every house. Damp, which is the most insidious of enemies. Stealthily and imperceptibly, the constitution of England was altered, and nobody knew it. Everywhere the effects were felt. The hardy country gentleman, who had sat down gladly to a meal of ale and beef, now felt chilly. Rugs appeared. Beards were grown. The chill which he felt in his legs, the country gentleman soon transferred to his house. Furniture was muffled. Walls and tables were covered. Nothing was left bare. Outside the house, it was another effect of the damp. Ivy grew in unparalleled profusion. Houses that had been of bare stone were smothered in greenery. What light penetrated to the bedrooms where children were born was naturally of an obfusc green, and what light penetrated to the drawing-rooms where grown men and women lived came through curtains of brown plush. But the change did not stop at outward things. The damp struck within. Men felt the chill in their hearts, the damp in their minds. In a desperate effort to snuggle their feelings into some sort of warmth, one subterfuge was tried after another. Love, birth, and death were all swaddled in a variety of fine phrases. The sexes drew further and further apart. No open conversation was tolerated. Evasions and concealments were sedulously practised on both sides. And just as the ivy and the evergreen rioted in the damp earth outside, so did the same fertility show itself within. The life of an average woman was a succession of childbirths. She married at 19 and had 15 or 18 children by the time she was 30, for twins abounded. Thus the British Empire came into existence, and thus, for there is no stopping damp, it gets into the inkpot as it gets into the woodwork, sentences swelled, adjectives multiplied, lyrics became epics. Even Orlando was forced to acknowledge that times were changed. One afternoon, in the early part of the century, she was driving through St. James's Park in her old panelled coach, when, as she passed Buckingham Palace, her eyes seemed forced by a superior power down upon her knees. Suddenly she saw, with a start, that she was wearing black breeches. She never ceased blushing till she had reached her country house, which, considering the time it takes 4 horses to trot 30 miles, will be taken, we hope, as a signal proof of her chastity. Once there, she followed what had now become the most imperious need of her nature, and wrapped herself as well as she could in a damask quilt, which she snatched from her bed. She explained to the widow Bartholomew, who was housekeeper, that she felt chilly. "So do we all, my lady," said the widow, heaving a profound sigh. "The walls is sweating." And sure enough, she had only to lay her hand on the oak panels for the fingerprints to be marked there. It was in this very room, remembered Orlando, that Queen Elizabeth had stood astride the fireplace with a flagon of beer in her hand. But when Orlando leapt to her feet, as the mere thought of that great queen commanded, the bed-quilt tripped her up, and she fell back in her armchair with a curse. Tomorrow she would have to buy 20 yards or more of black bombazine, she supposed, to make a skirt. And then, here she blushed, she would have to buy a crinoline. And then, here she blushed, a bassinet, and so on. One might see the spirit of the age blowing, now hot, now cold, upon her cheeks. At length the colour on her cheeks resumed its stability. Then Orlando felt in the bosom of her shirt, and drew out a roll of paper, sea-stained, blood-stained, travel-stained, the manuscript of her poem, The Oak Tree. She had carried this about with her for so many years now, and many of the pages were torn. She turned back to the first page, and read the date, 1586, written in her own boyish hand. She had been working at it for close on 300 years now. It was time to make an end. Meanwhile, she became conscious of an extraordinary tingling and vibration all over her, as if she were made of 1,000 wires upon which errant fingers were playing scales. Now her toes tingled, now her marrow. She had the queerest sensations about the thigh bones. Her hairs seemed to erect themselves. Her arms sang and twanged as the telegraph wires would be singing and twanging in 20 years or so. All this agitation seemed at length to concentrate in her hands, and then in one hand, and then in one finger of that hand, and then finally to contract itself, so that it made a ring of quivering sensibility about the second finger of the left hand. And when she raised it to see what caused this agitation, she saw nothing. Nothing but the vast solitary emerald which Queen Elizabeth had given her. And was that not enough? She asked. It was worth £10,000 at least. The vibration seemed, in the oddest way, to say, no, that is not enough, till poor Orlando felt positively ashamed of the second finger of her left hand, without in the least knowing why. At this moment Bartholomew came in to ask which dress she should lay out for dinner, and Orlando instantly glanced at Bartholomew's left hand and instantly perceived what she'd never noticed before. A thick ring of rather jaundiced yellow, circling the third finger where her own was bare. "Let me look at your ring, Bartholomew," she said. At this, Bartholomew started back a pace or two. "No," she said, with resolute dignity. "Her ladyship might look if she pleased, but as for taking off her wedding ring, not the Archbishop, nor the Pope, nor Queen Victoria on her throne could force her to do that. Her Thomas had put it on her finger 25 years, 6 months, 3 weeks ago. She had slept in it, worked in it, washed in it, prayed in it, and proposed to be buried in it." "Heaven help us," said Orlando, standing at the window. "What a world we live in. What a world, to be sure." Its complexities amazed her. It now seemed to her that the whole world was ringed with gold. She went in to dinner. Wedding rings abounded. She went to church. Wedding rings were everywhere. She drove out. They glowed dully on every hand. Rings filled the jewellers' shops. At the same time she began to notice a new habit among the town people. In the old days one would meet a boy trifling with a girl under a hawthorn hedge frequently enough. Orlando had flicked many a couple with the tip of her whip and laughed and passed on. Now all that was changed. Couples trudged in the middle of the road indissolubly linked together. The woman's right hand was invariably passed through the man's left. Though they moved, it was all in one piece, heavily. Orlando could only suppose that some new discovery had been made about the race, that they were somehow stuck together, couple after couple, but who had made it and when she could not guess. It did not seem to be nature. She looked at the doves and the rabbits and the elk hounds, and she could not see that nature had changed her ways or mended them since the time of Elizabeth at least. There was no indissoluble alliance among the brutes that she could see. Could it be Queen Victoria, then? Or Lord Melbourne? Was it from them that the great discovery of marriage proceeded? It was strange. It was distasteful. Indeed, there was something in this indissolubility of bodies which was repugnant to her sense of decency and sanitation. Her ruminations, however, were accompanied by such a tingling and twangling of the afflicted finger that she could scarcely keep her ideas in order. Though the seat of her trouble seemed to be the left hand, she could feel herself poisoned through and through, and was forced at length to consider the most desperate of remedies, which was to yield completely and submissively to the spirit of the age, and take a husband. That this was much against her natural temperament has been sufficiently made plain. Orlando had inclined herself naturally to the Elizabethan spirit, to the Restoration spirit, to the spirit of the 18th century. But the spirit of the 19th century was antipathetic to her in the extreme, and thus it took her and broke her, and she was aware of her defeat at its hands, as she had never been before. So she stood mournfully at the drawing-room window, dragged down by the weight of the crinoline which she had submissively adopted. It was heavier and more drab than any dress she had yet worn. None had ever so impeded her movements. No longer could she run lightly to the high mound and fling herself beneath the oak tree. Her skirts collected damp leaves and straw. Her muscles had lost their pliancy. All these things inclined her, step by step, to submit to the new discovery, that each man and each woman has another allotted to it for life, whom it supports, by whom it is supported, till death do them part. It would be a comfort, she felt, to lean. But whom could she lean upon? Not Mr. M. He was become a Catholic. Nor the Marquis of C. He made sacks in Botany Bay. Nor the Lord O. He had long been food for fishes. One way or another, all her old cronies were gone now, and the Nells and Kits of Drury Lane, much though she favoured them, scarcely did to lean upon. Whom, she asked, can I lean upon? It was not Orlando who spoke, but the spirit of the age. But nobody answered it. The rain had stopped at last, and there was an iridescence in the sky which tempted her to put on her plumed hat and her little stringed shoes and stroll out before dinner. Everyone is mated except myself, she mused, as she trailed disconsolately across the courtyard. Whereas I, who am mistress of it all, am single, am mateless, am alone. At every step she glanced nervously, lest some male form should be hiding behind a furze bush. But there were only the rooks flaunting in the sky. As they went whirling and wheeling above her head, she followed them over the moor, up the hill. She had not walked so far for years. She quickened her pace. She ran. She tripped. The tough heather roots flung her to the ground. Her ankle was broken. She could not rise. But there she lay content. The scent of bog myrtle was in her nostrils. The rook's hoarse laughter was in her ears. I have found my mate, she said. It is the moor. I am nature's bride. Here will I lie. I shall dream wild dreams. My hands shall wear no wedding ring. The roots shall twine about them. I have known many men and many women. None have I understood. It is better that I should lie at peace here with only the sky above me, as the gypsy told me years ago. Her eyes slowly lowered themselves down and down, till they came to the rain-darkened earth. Indeed, she was falling asleep, with her ear pressed to the ground, when she heard, deep within, some hammer on an anvil, or was it a heart beating? Tick-tock, tick-tock, so it hammered, until, as she listened, she thought it changed to the trot of a horse's hoofs. She sat upright. Towering dark against the sky, she saw a man on horseback. "Madam," said the man, leaping to the ground, "you're hurt." A few minutes later, they became engaged. End of side 3. Side 4. The morning after, as they sat at breakfast, the man on horseback told her his name, It was Marmaduke Bonthrop Shelmerdine, Esquire. "I knew it," she said, for there was something romantic and chivalrous, passionate, melancholy, yet determined about him, which went with the wild, dark-plumed name. "Mine is Orlando," she said. He had guessed it. For if you see a ship in full sail, coming with the sun on it proudly sweeping across the Mediterranean from the South Seas, one says at once, "Orlando," he explained. In fact, though their acquaintance had been so short, they had guessed, as always happens between lovers, everything of any importance about each other in 2 seconds at the utmost, and it now remained only to fill in such unimportant details as what they were called, where they lived, and whether they were beggars or people of substance. He had a castle in the Hebrides, but it was ruined, he told her. He was on his way now to join his brig at Falmouth, but the wind had fallen, and it was only when the gale blew from the southwest that he could put out to sea. Orlando looked hastily at the weather vane. Mercifully, its tail pointed due east, and was steady as a rock. "Oh, Shell, don't leave me," she cried. "I am passionately in love with you." No sooner had the words left her mouth than an awful suspicion rushed into both their minds simultaneously. "You're a woman, Shell," she said. "You're a man, Orlando." Never was there such a scene of protestation and demonstration as then took place since the world began. When it was over and they were seated again, she asked him, what was this talk of a southwest gale? Where was he bound for? "For the Horn," he said. She gathered that his life was spent in the most desperate and splendid of adventures, which is to voyage round Cape Horn in the teeth of a gale. "Shell, my darling," she began again, "tell me—" And so they talked 2 hours or more, perhaps about Cape Horn, perhaps not, and really it would profit little to report what they said, for they knew each other so well that they could say anything, which is tantamount to saying nothing. For which reasons we leave a great blank here, which must be taken to indicate that the space is filled to repletion. One morning, the butler entered with the information that there was a couple of peelers downstairs with a warrant from the Queen. "Show 'em up," said Shelmerdine, taking up by instinct a stand with his hands behind him in front of the fireplace. 2 officers in bottle-green uniforms with truncheons at their hips then entered the room and stood at attention. Formalities being over, they gave into Orlando's own hands, as their commission was, a legal document of some very impressive sort, judging by the blobs of sealing wax, the ribbons, the oaths, and the signatures, which were all of the highest importance. Orlando ran her eyes through it, and then read out the following facts. "The lawsuits are settled, some in my favour, others not. Turkish marriage annulled. Children pronounced illegitimate. They said I had 3 sons by Pepita, a Spanish dancer. So they don't inherit, which is all to the good. Sex? My sex is pronounced indisputably and beyond the shadow of a doubt, female. The estates, which are now desequestrated in perpetuity, descend and are tailed and entailed upon the heirs male of my body, or in default of marriage." But here she grew impatient with this legal verbiage, and said, "But there won't be any default of marriage, nor of heirs either, so the rest can be taken as read." Whereupon she appended her own signature beneath Lord Palmerston's, and entered from that moment into the undisturbed possession of her titles, her house, and her estate, which was now so much shrunk, for the cost of the lawsuits had been prodigious, that, though she was infinitely noble again, she was also excessively poor. When the result of the lawsuit was made known, her table was snowed under with invitations from the Countess of R, Lady Q, the Marchioness of P, and others, beseeching the pleasure of her company. But she was in the dark woods with Shelmerdine alone. "Tell me, Ma," she would say, "about Cape Horn." Then Shelmerdine would make a little model on the ground of the cape with twigs and dead leaves. "Here's the north," he would say. "There's the south. The wind's coming from hereabouts. Now the brig is sailing due west. We've just lowered the top-boom mizzen. And so he would go on, and she would listen to every word, interpreting them rightly, so as to see, without his having to tell her, the phosphorescence on the waves, the icicles clanking in the shrouds. All this and 1,000 other things she understood him to say. He was surprised and delighted to find how well she had taken his meaning. "Are you positive you aren't a man?" he would ask, and she would echo, "Can it be possible you are not a woman?" And then they must put it to the proof without more ado, for each was so surprised at the quickness of the other's sympathy, and it was such a revelation that a woman could be as tolerant and free-spoken as a man, and a man as strange and subtle as a woman, that they had to put the matter to the proof at once. So they would talk. 8 or 9 days had been spent thus, but on the 10th, which was the 26th of October, Orlando was lying in the bracken while Shelmardine recited Shelley, when a leaf whipped briskly across Orlando's foot. A second leaf followed, and then a third. Orlando shivered and turned pale. It was the wind. Shelmardine leapt to his feet. "The wind!" he cried. Together they ran through the woods, the wind plastering them with leaves as they ran, to the great court, and through it till they reached the chapel, and there a scattering of lights was lit as fast as could be. Bells were rung, people were summoned. At length there was Mr. Dupper, the chaplain, asking where was the prayer-book, and they thrust it in his hands, and he searched hastily, fluttering the pages, and said, "Marmaduke Bonthrop Shelmardine and Lady Orlando, kneel down." And they knelt down, and the organ sounded, and Mr. Dupper, who was grown a very old man, tried now to raise his voice above the uproar, and could not be heard, while all the estate servants kept pressing in to listen. And now there was a clap of thunder, so that no one heard the word "obey" spoken, or saw the ring pass from hand to hand. All was movement and confusion, and up they rose with the organ booming, and the lightning playing, and the rain pouring. And the Lady Orlando, with her ring on her finger, went out into the court in her thin dress, and held the swinging stirrup, for the horse was bitted and bridled, and the foam was still on his flank, for her husband to mount, which he did with one bound. And the horse leapt forward, and Orlando cried out, "Marmaduke Bonthrop Shelmardine," and he answered her, "Orlando." And the words went dashing and circling like wild hawks, higher and higher, and faster they circled, till they crashed and fell in a shower of fragments to the ground. And she went indoors. It was completely still. It was very silent. There was the ink-pot. There was the pen. There was the manuscript of her poem, broken off in the middle of a tribute to eternity. She had been about to say, "Nothing changes," and then, in the space of 3 seconds and a half, everything had changed. She had broken her ankle, fallen in love, married Shelmardine. There was the wedding ring on her finger to prove it. She had in mind the effect that her behaviour would have upon the spirit of the age. She was extremely anxious to be informed whether the steps she had taken in the matter of getting engaged to Shelmardine and marrying him met with its approval. She was certainly feeling more herself. Her finger had not tingled once since that night on the moor. Yet she could not deny that she had her doubts. She was married, true. But if one's husband is always sailing round Cape Horn, was it marriage? If one liked him, was it marriage? If one liked other people, was it marriage? And finally, if one still wished more than anything in the whole world to write poetry, was it marriage? She had her doubts. But she would put it to the test. She looked at the ring. She looked at the ink-pot. Did she dare? No, she did not. But she must. No, she could not. What should she do then? Hang it all, she said. And she plunged her pen neck-deep in the ink. To her enormous surprise, there was no explosion. She drew the nib out. As she wrote, she performed a deep obeisance to the spirit of the age, such as a traveller, conscious that he has a bundle of cigars in the corner of his suitcase, makes to the customs officer who has obligingly made a scribble of white chalk on the lid. For she was extremely doubtful whether, if the spirit had examined the contents of her mind carefully, it would not have found something highly contraband for which she would have had to pay the full fine. She had only escaped by the skin of her teeth. She had just managed, by some dexterous deference to the spirit of the age, by putting on a ring and finding a man on a moor, by loving nature and being no satirist, cynic, or psychologist, to pass its examination successfully. And she heaved a deep sigh of relief, as indeed well she might. For she need neither fight her age nor submit to it. She was of it, yet remained herself. Now, therefore, she could write, and write she did. It was now November. After November comes December. Then January, February, March, and April. After April comes May. June, July, August follow. Next is September. Then October. And so, behold, here we are back at November again with a whole year accomplished. This method of writing biography, though it has its merits, is a little bare, perhaps. But what can the biographer do when his subject has put him in the predicament into which Orlando has now put us? Sitting in a chair and thinking is what Orlando is doing now. Therefore there is nothing for it but to recite the calendar, blow one's nose, look out of the window until she is done. Anything is a fitter subject for novelist or biographer than this thinking, this sitting in a chair day in, day out, with a sheet of paper and a pen and an inkpot. But Orlando was a woman. Lord Palmerston had just proved it. And when we are writing the life of a woman, we may, it is agreed, waive our demand for action and substitute love instead. Love, the poet has said, is woman's whole existence. And if we look for a moment at Orlando writing at her table, we must admit that never was there a woman more fitted for that calling. At this moment, Orlando pushed away her chair, stretched her arms, dropped her pen, came to the window, and exclaimed, "Done!" She was almost felled to the ground by the extraordinary sight which now met her eyes. There was the garden and some birds. The world was going on as usual. All the time she was writing, the world had continued. "And if I were dead, it would be just the same," she said. For a moment she stood looking at the indifferent spectacle with staring eyes. At length she was revived in a singular way. The manuscript, which reposed above her heart, began shuffling and beating as if it were a living thing. It wanted to be read. It would die in her bosom if it were not read. For the first time in her life she turned with violence against nature. Elk-hounds and rose-bushes were about her in profusion. But elk-hounds and rose-bushes can none of them read. Human beings alone are thus gifted. Human beings had become necessary. She rang the bell. She ordered the carriage to take her to London at once. "There's just time to catch the 11:45, my lady," said the butler. Orlando had not yet realized the invention of the steam engine, but such was her absorption that she took her seat in a railway carriage without giving a thought to that stupendous invention. Lost in thought, she was whirled up to London in something less than an hour, and stood on the platform at Charing Cross, not knowing where to go. The old house at Blackfriars, where she had spent so many pleasant days in the 18th century, was now sold, part to the Salvation Army, part to an umbrella factory. She had bought another in Mayfair, which was sanitary, convenient, and in the heart of the fashionable world. But was it in Mayfair that her poem would be relieved of its desire? she walked out into the Strand. There, vehicles of all sizes, drawn by blood horses and by dray horses, conveying one solitary dowager, or crowded to the top by whiskered men in silk hats, were inextricably mixed. To her ears, attuned to a pen-scratching, the uproar of the street sounded violently and hideously cacophonous. Every inch of the pavement was crowded. Streams of people poured incessantly east and west. She looked anxiously at people's faces, but that confused her still more. Here would come by a man sunk in despair, muttering to himself as if he knew some terrible sorrow. Past him would nudge a jolly-faced fellow, shouldering his way along as if it were a festival for all the world. Indeed, she came to the conclusion that there was neither rhyme nor reason in any of it. Each man and each woman was bent on his own affairs. And where was she to go? She walked on, up one street and down another, until her mind was dizzied with the monotony, and something fluttering above her heart rebuked her with having forgotten all about it. It was her manuscript, the oak tree. She was confounded at her own neglect. She stopped dead where she stood. No coach was in sight. The street, which was wide and handsome, was singularly empty. Only one elderly gentleman was approaching. There was something vaguely familiar to her in his walk. As he came nearer, she felt certain that she had met him at some time or other. But where? Could it be that this gentleman, so neat, so portly, so prosperous, with a cane in his hand and a flower in his buttonhole, with a pink, plump face and combed white moustaches? Could it be? Yes, by Jove, it was. Her very old friend, Nick Green. At the same time, he looked at her, remembered her, recognized her. "The Lady Orlando," he said, sweeping his silk hat almost in the dust. "Sir Nicholas," she said, for she was made aware intuitively by something in his bearing that the scurrilous penny-a-liner who had lampooned her and many another in the time of Queen Elizabeth was now risen in the world and become certainly a knight, and doubtless a dozen other fine things into the bargain. With another bow, he acknowledged that her conclusion was correct. He was a knight. He was a professor. He was the author of a score of volumes. He was, in short, the most influential critic of the Victorian age. But even as she marvelled, he made another bow and asked her whether she would honour him by lunching with him. The bow was a thought overdone, perhaps, but the imitation of fine breeding was creditable. She followed him, wondering, into a superb restaurant, all red plush, white tablecloths and silver cruets, as unlike as could be the old tavern with its sanded floor and its broadsheets and spittoons. He laid his gloves neatly on the table beside him. Still she could hardly believe that he was the same man. His nails were clean where they used to be an inch long. His chin was shaved where a black beard used to sprout. It was not, indeed, until he had ordered the wine, which he did with a care that reminded her of his taste in Malmsey long ago, that she was convinced he was the same man. "Ah," he said, "my dear lady, the great days of literature are over. Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, those were the giants. Dryden, Pope, Addison, those were the heroes. All are dead now. And whom have they left us? Tennyson, Browning, Carlyle. The truth of it is," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine, "that all our young writers are in the pay of booksellers. They turn out any trash that serves to pay their tailors' bills. No, my dear lady, the great days are over. We live in degenerate times. We must cherish the past, honour those writers, there are still a few left of them, who take antiquity for their model, and write, not for pay, but—" Here Orlando almost shouted, "Glaw!" Indeed, she could have sworn that she had heard him say the very same things 300 years ago. Nick Green had not changed for all his knighthood. And yet some change there was. He had grown plump, he had grown sleek. Literature had been a prosperous pursuit, evidently. but somehow the old restless, uneasy vivacity had gone. He had an air of respectability about him which was depressing. Orlando was unaccountably disappointed. She had thought of literature all these years as something wild as the wind, hot as fire, something errant, incalculable, abrupt. And behold, literature was an elderly gentleman in a grey suit. The violence of her disillusionment was such that some hook or button fastening the upper part of her dress burst open, and out upon the table fell The Oak Tree, a Poem. "A manuscript," said Sir Nicholas, putting on his gold pince-nez. "How interesting! How excessively interesting! Permit me to look at it." And once more, after an interval of some 300 years, Nicholas Green took Orlando's poem, and laying it down among the coffee cups and the liqueur glasses, began to read it. But now his verdict was very different from what it had been then. It reminded him, he said as he turned over the pages, of Addison's Cato. It compared favourably with Thomson's Seasons. There was no trace in it, he was thankful to say, of the modern spirit. It was composed with a regard to truth, to nature, which was rare indeed in these days of unscrupulous eccentricity. It must, of course, be published instantly. He explained that he was alluding to the fact that Messrs. Here he mentioned a well-known firm of publishers, would be delighted, if he wrote them a line, to put the book on their list. He could probably arrange for a royalty of 10% on all copies up to 2,000. After that it would be 15. As for the reviewers, he would himself write a line to Mr. X, who was the most influential. Then a compliment addressed to the wife of the editor of the Y never did any harm. So he ran on. Orlando understood nothing of all this, but there was nothing for it but to submit to what was evidently his wish and the fervent desire of the poem itself. So Sir Nicholas flattened the blood-stained packet into his breast pocket, and with many compliments on both sides, they parted. Orlando walked up the street. Now that the poem was gone, and she felt a bare place in her breast where she had been used to carry it, she had nothing to do but reflect upon whatever she liked. Here she was in St. James's Street, a married woman with a ring on her finger. What, then, was life? The thought popped into her head violently, irrelevantly, and it may be taken as a comment, adverse or favourable, upon her relations with her husband, who was at the Horn, that whenever anything popped violently into her head, she went straight to the nearest telegraph office and wired it to him. "My God, Shell," she wired. "Life, literature, Green, Toady." Here she dropped into a cipher language which they had invented between them, so that a whole spiritual state of the utmost complexity might be conveyed in a word or two, without the telegraph clerk being any the wiser. There could be no answer to her telegram for some hours. Indeed, it was probable, she thought, that there was a gale at Cape Horn, so that her husband would be at the masthead, or even alone in a boat with a biscuit. And so, leaving the post office, she turned to beguile herself into the next shop, which was a shop so common in our day that it needs no description, yet to her eyes strange in the extreme, a shop where they sold books. All her life long, Orlando had known manuscripts. She had held in her hands the rough brown sheets on which Spenser had written. She had seen Shakespeare's script, and Milton's. But these innumerable little volumes, bright, identical, ephemeral, for they seemed bound in cardboard and printed on tissue paper, surprised her infinitely. The whole works of Shakespeare cost half a crown, and could be put in your pocket. Works. The works of every writer she had known or heard of, and many more, stretched from end to end of the long shelves. On tables and chairs more works were piled and tumbled, and these, she saw, were often works about other works, by Sir Nicholas and a score of others, whom, in her ignorance, since they were bound and printed, she supposed to be very great writers too. So she gave an astounding order to the bookseller to send her everything of any importance in the shop, and left. Stepping across the threshold of her house, she found her discreet 18th-century hall completely littered with parcels. While she had been sitting by the Serpentine in Hyde Park, the bookseller had delivered her order, and the house was crammed with the whole of Victorian literature done up in grey paper and neatly tied with string. Accustomed to the little literatures of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, Orlando was appalled by the consequences of her order. For, of course, to the Victorians themselves, Victorian literature meant not merely 4 great names separate and distinct, but 4 great names sunk and embedded in a mass of Alexander Smiths, Dixons, Blacks, Milmans, Buckles, Taines, Paynes, Tuppers, Jamesons, all vocal, clamorous, prominent, and requiring as much attention as anybody else. Orlando's reverence for print had a tough job set before it, but drawing her chair to the window to get the benefit of what light might filter between the high houses of Mayfair, she tried to come to a conclusion. Having come to which, since time runs short, Orlando stood looking out of the window for a considerable space of time. Behold, meanwhile, the factory chimneys and their smoke. Behold the city clerks flashing by in their outrigger. Behold the old lady taking her dog for a walk, and the servant girl wearing her new hat for the first time not at the right angle. Behold them all. Though heaven has mercifully decreed that the secrets of all hearts are hidden, so that we are lured on for ever to suspect something, perhaps, that does not exist, still we salute the splendid fulfilment of natural desires for a hat, for a boat, for a rat in a ditch. Hail, natural desire! Hail, happiness, divine happiness, and pleasure of all sorts, flowers and wine, though one fades and the other intoxicates, and half-crown tickets out of London on Sundays, and singing in a dark chapel hymns about death, and anything that interrupts and confounds the tapping of typewriters, and filing of letters, and forging of links and chains binding the empire together. Hail even the crude red bows on shopgirls' lips. Hail happiness, and all fulfilment of natural desire, whether it is what the male novelist says it is, or prayer, or denial. Hail in whatever form it comes, and may there be more forms, and stranger, for dark flows the stream. "It's a very fine boy, my lady," said Mrs. Banting, the midwife, putting her firstborn child into Orlando's arms. In other words, Orlando was safely delivered of a son on Thursday, March the 20th, at 3 o'clock in the morning. Once more Orlando stood at the window. But nothing of the same sort is going to happen today, which is not by any means the same day. No, for if we look out of the window, as Orlando was doing at the moment, we shall see that Park Lane itself has considerably changed. "Look at that," she said some days later, when an absurd truncated carriage without any horses began to glide about of its own accord. A carriage without any horses, indeed. She was called away just as she said that, but came back again after a time and had another look out of the window. It was odd sort of weather nowadays. The sky itself, she could not help thinking, had changed. It was no longer so thick, so watery, now that King Edward had succeeded Queen Victoria. The clouds had shrunk to a thin gauze. It was a little alarming, this shrinkage. Everything seemed to have shrunk. But it was now, in the evening, that the change was most remarkable. Look at the lights in the houses. At a touch, a whole room was lit. Hundreds of rooms were lit, and one was precisely the same as the other. One could see everything in the little square-shaped boxes. There was no privacy, none of those lingering shadows and odd corners there used to be. At a touch, the whole room was bright, and the sky was bright all night long, and the pavements were bright. Everything was bright. She came back again at midday. How narrow women have grown lately. They looked like stalks of corn, straight, shining, identical, and men's faces were as bare as the palm of one's hand. There was something definite and distinct about the age, which reminded her of the 18th century, except that there was a distraction, a desperation. As she was thinking this, the immensely long tunnel in which she seemed to have been travelling for hundreds of years widened. The light poured in. Her thoughts became mysteriously tightened and strung up as if a piano tuner had put his key in her back and stretched her nerves very taut. At the same time, her hearing quickened. She could hear every whisper and crackle in the room, so that the clock ticking on the mantelpiece beat like a hammer. And so, for some seconds, the light went on becoming brighter and brighter, and she saw everything more and more clearly, and the clock ticked louder and louder, until there was a terrific explosion right in her ear. Orlando leapt as if she had been violently struck on the head. 10 times she was struck. In fact, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. It was the 11th of October. It was 1928. It was the present moment. No one need wonder that Orlando started, pressed her hand to her heart, and turned pale. For what more terrifying revelation can there be than that it is the present moment? That we survive the shock at all is only possible because the past shelters us on one side, and the future on the other. But we have no time now for reflections. Orlando was terribly late already. She ran downstairs, she jumped into her motor car, and was off. Vast blue blocks of building rose into the air. The red cowls of chimneys were spotted irregularly across the sky. The road shone like silver-headed nails. But she did not allow these sights to sink into her mind even the fraction of an inch as she crossed the narrow plank of the present, lest she should fall into the raging torrent beneath. "Why don't you look where you're going to?" That was all she said, for the streets were immensely crowded. People crossed without looking where they were going. People buzzed and hummed round the plate-glass windows as if they were bees, Orlando thought. But her thought that they were bees was violently snipped off, and she saw, regaining perspective with one flick of her eye, that they were bodies. At last, however, she drew up at Marshall and Snellgrove's and went into the shop. Shade and scent enveloped her. The present fell from her like drops of scalding water. She took a list from her bag and began reading in a curious, stiff voice at first. Boys' boots, bath salts, sardines. So she stood in the ground-floor department of Messrs. Marshall and Snellgrove, looked this way and that, snuffed this smell and that, and thus wasted some seconds. Then she got into the lift, for the good reason that the door stood open, and was shot smoothly upwards. The very fabric of life now, she thought as she rose, is magic. In the 18th century we knew how everything was done, but here I rise through the air, listen to voices in America, see men flying. But how it's done, I can't even begin to wonder. So my belief in magic returns. Now the lift gave a little jerk as it stopped at the first floor, and each time the lift stopped and flung its doors open, there was another slice of the world displayed, with all the smells of that world clinging to it. She was reminded of the river off Wapping in the time of Elizabeth, where the treasure ships and the merchant ships used to anchor. How richly and curiously they had smelt. But here, as the lift could go no higher, she must get out. Heaven knows into what department, as they called it. She stood still to consult her shopping list, but was blessed if she could see, as the list bade her, bath salts or boys' boots anywhere about. And indeed she was about to descend again, but was saved by saying aloud automatically the last item on her list, which happened to be sheets for a double bed. "Sheets for a double bed," she said to a man at a counter, and by a dispensation of Providence it was sheets that the man at that particular counter happened to sell. For Louise had come to her in a great taking the other day, for she had found a hole in the bottom of the sheet in the royal bed. Many kings and queens had slept there, Elizabeth, James, Charles, George, Victoria, Edward. No wonder the sheet had a hole in it. But Louise was positive she knew who had done it. It was the Prince Consort. "Sheets for a double bed," said Orlando. While the man went to get sheets for a double bed, she took out a little looking-glass and a powder-puff. Women were not nearly as roundabout in their ways, she thought, powdering herself with the greatest unconcern, as they had been when she herself first turned woman and lay on the deck of the enamoured lady. Honestly, though she was now 36, she scarcely looked a day older. She looked just as pouting, as sulky, as she had done that day on the ice when the Thames was frozen and she had gone skating with Sasha. "The best Irish linen, ma'am," said the shopman. Here, as she was fingering the linen abstractedly, one of the swing doors between the departments opened and let through a whiff of scent, waxen, tinted as if from pink candles, and the scent curved like a shell around a figure. Was it a boy's or was it a girl's? Young, slender, seductive. A girl, by God, furred, pearled, in Russian trousers. But faithless, faithless. "Faithless!" cried Orlando. The man had gone. And far off she saw the masts of the Russian ship standing out to sea. And then, miraculously, perhaps the door opened again. A fat, furred woman, marvellously well preserved, a Grand Duke's mistress, began walking down the shop towards her. "Oh, Sasha," cried Orlando. Really, she was shocked that she should have come to this. She had grown so fat, so lethargic, and she bowed her head over the linen so that this apparition of a grey woman in fur and a girl in Russian trousers might pass behind her back unseen. "Any napkins, towels, dusters today, ma'am?" said the shopman. And it is enormously to the credit of the shopping list, which Orlando now consulted, that she was able to reply with every appearance of composure that there was only one thing in the world she wanted, and that was bath salts, which was in another department. But descending in the lift again, she was again sunk far beneath the present moment. As for finding the right department, whatever it might be, she stood engrossed among the handbags. Through the great glass doors, she could see the traffic in Oxford Street. "Time has passed over me," she thought, trying to collect herself. "This is the oncome of middle age. How strange it is. Nobody is any longer one thing. Someone lights a pink candle, and I see a girl in Russian trousers. When I step out of doors, as I do now—" Here she stepped onto the pavement of Oxford Street. "What is it that I taste? Little herbs. I hear goat bells. I see mountains. Turkey? India? Persia?" Her eyes filled with tears. That Orlando had gone a little too far from the present moment will perhaps strike you as you see her now preparing to get into her motor car with her eyes full of tears and visions of Persian mountains. Of the most successful practitioners of the art of life, we can justly say that they live precisely the years allotted them on the tombstone. Of the rest, some we know to be dead, though they walk among us. Some are not yet born, though they go through the forms of life. Others are hundreds of years old, though they call themselves 36. The true length of a person's life is always a matter of dispute. Now, as Orlando stood with her hand on the door of her motor car, the present again struck her on the head. 11 times she was violently assaulted. Swiftly she drove up the curving drive between the elms and oaks. Now she was alone. The autumn leaves were falling. To see Orlando change her skirt for a pair of whipcord breeches and leather jacket, which she did in less than 3 minutes, was to be ravished with the beauty of movement. Then she strode into the dining room, where her old friends Dryden, Pope, Swift, Addison regarded her. She cut herself a slice of bread and ham, clapped the two together, and began to eat, striding up and down the room. After 5 or 6 such turns, she tossed off a glass of red Spanish wine, and, filling another which she carried in her hand, strode down the long corridor and through a dozen drawing-rooms, and began a perambulation of the house, attended by such elk-hounds and spaniels as chose to follow her. This, too, was all in the day's routine. As soon would she come home and leave her own grandmother without a kiss, as come back and leave the house unvisited. She fancied that the rooms brightened as she came in, stirred, opened their eyes, as if they had been dozing in her absence. Why not indeed? They had known each other for close on 4 centuries now. They knew her in all her moods and changes. She had hidden nothing from them, had come to them as boy and woman, crying and dancing. In this window seat she had written her first verses. In that chapel she had been married. She, who believed in no immortality, could not help feeling that her soul would come and go forever, with the reds on the panels and the greens on the sofa. Now, calling her troops of dogs to her, she passed down the gallery whose floor was laid with whole oak trees sawn across. Rows of chairs with all their velvet arms faded stood ranged against the wall, holding their arms out for Elizabeth, for James, for Shakespeare. The sight made her gloomy. Great wings of silence beat up and down the empty house. So she sat at the end of the gallery in Queen Elizabeth's hard armchair. The gallery stretched far away to a point where the light almost failed. It was as a tunnel bored deep into the past. As her eyes peered down it, she could see people laughing and talking. The great men she had known, and statesmen in colloquy, and lovers dallying in the window seat, and people eating and drinking at the long tables. Like thunder, the stable clock struck 4. Never did any earthquake so demolish a whole town. The gallery and all its occupants fell to powder. Her own face, that had been dark and sombre as she gazed, was lit as by an explosion of gunpowder. In this same light, everything near her showed with extreme distinctness. She saw 2 flies circling round. She saw a knot in the wood where her foot was. She rose, but without precipitation, called her dogs, and went firmly but with great alertness of movement down the staircase and out into the garden. Here the shadows of the plants were miraculously distinct. She noticed the separate grains of earth in the flower beds as if she had a microscope stuck to her eye. She saw the intricacy of the twigs of every tree. Each blade of grass was distinct, and the marking of veins and petals. Immediately the ferny path up the hill along which she was walking became not entirely a path, but partly the serpentine. The hawthorn bushes were partly ladies and gentlemen. The sheep were partly tall Mayfair houses. Everything was partly something else. The ferny path led, with many turns and windings, higher and higher to the oak tree, which stood on the top. The tree had grown bigger, sturdier, and more knotted since she had known it, somewhere about the year 1588, but it was still in the prime of life. The little sharply frilled leaves were still fluttering thickly on its branches. Flinging herself on the ground, she felt the bones of the tree running out like ribs from a spine this way and that beneath her. She liked to think she was riding the back of the world. She liked to attach herself to something hard. As she flung herself down, a little square book bound in red cloth fell from the breast of her leather jacket. Her poem, The Oak Tree. I should have brought a trowel, she reflected. The earth was so shallow over the roots that it seemed doubtful if she could do as she meant and bury the book here. Besides, the dogs would dig it up. No luck ever attends these symbolical celebrations, she thought. What could have been more secret, she thought, more slow and like the intercourse of lovers, than the stammering answer she had made all these years to the old crooning song of the woods, and the farms, and the brown horses standing at the gate, and the smithy, and the kitchen, and the fields. So she let her book lie unburied on the ground, and watched the vast view, with the sun lightening it and the shadows darkening it. There was a village with a church tower among elm trees. In the far distance, Snowdon's crags broke white among the clouds. The bare mountains of Turkey were before her. It was blazing noon. She looked straight at the baked hillside. At this moment, some church clock chimed in the valley. The landscape collapsed and fell. The present showered down upon her head once more. Whether it had struck 9, 10, or 11, she could not say. Night had come. Night that she loved of all times. Night in which the reflections in the dark pool of the mind shine more clearly than by day. Now Shakespeare, now a girl in Russian trousers, now the Atlantic itself where it storms in great waves past Cape Horn. She looked into the darkness. There was her husband's brig. Ecstasy, ecstasy, she cried. Marmaduke, Bonthrop, Shelmardine. The beautiful glittering name fell out of the sky like a steel-blue feather. As she spoke, the first stroke of midnight sounded. The cold breeze of the present brushed her face with its little breath of fear. Here, Shell, here, she cried, baring her breast to the moon. And as Shelmardine leapt to the ground, there sprang up over his head a single wild bird. "It is the goose," cried Orlando, "the wild goose." And the 12th stroke of midnight sounded. The 12th stroke of midnight, Thursday, the 11th of October, 1928.